Blood soaked into the dry California dust, staining the yellow mustard weeds a rusted, ugly brown. Gideon Blackwell, a feared enforcer for the Sonoma County Hells Angels, was taking his final ragged breaths in a forgotten drainage ditch off Highway 1. Two bullet wounds, a shattered femur, and the crushing weight of a syndicate's betrayal pinning him to the earth. He closed his heavy eyes, fully expecting the Reaper. Instead, a small shadow fell over his battered face. It was not the Reaper. It was not a rival hitman returning to finish the job. It was a 7-year-old boy in grass-stained overalls clutching a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich. That solitary child was about to change the criminal underworld forever. 12 hours earlier, Gideon had sat at a scarred oak table inside the clubhouse on the outskirts of Petaluma. The air stank of stale beer and engine grease. Cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling and lazy blue ribbons drifting past the faded photographs of fallen brothers that lined the wood-paneled walls. On the table in front of him lay a heavy silver Zippo lighter. The lighter had belonged to his son Caleb, 19 years old, dead 14 months. Heroin cut with fentanyl distributed through a network that stretched from the Port of Oakland to every quiet suburb in Northern California. The pipeline belonged to Vincent Mercer, and hidden inside the hollow casing of that lighter, wrapped in a tiny piece of clear plastic, was a black micro SD card that could burn Mercer's empire to cinders. Gideon had spent the better part of a year gathering the evidence. It had consumed him the way grief consumed him, completely and without mercy. He had turned informants, bribed dock workers, broken into shipping containers at 2 a.m. with bolt cutters and a flashlight. He had photographed ledgers and copied hard drives and recorded conversations through walls so thin he could hear the ice clinking in the glasses on the other side. Shipping manifests, offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, coordinates of drop houses scattered across 3 counties, and most critically, the names of every corrupt judge, politician, and law enforcement officer on Mercer's payroll. It was the kind of leverage that could dismantle an entire criminal organization. It was also the kind of leverage that could get a man killed before sunrise. The chapter president had wanted to send a convoy. Gideon refused. A dozen Harleys roaring down the coast would attract the wrong kind of attention. He would ride alone, delivers a card to their contact in Santa Cruz, and be back before the morning fog burned off. It was a calculated risk, and it was the last mistake Gideon Blackwell ever planned to make. He had picked up the lighter before leaving the clubhouse, turned it over in his calloused hands. On the bottom, he had carved a password into the silver with the tip of a hunting knife. Panhead 1948. The year Harley-Davidson introduced the Panhead engine. It was also the year his own father was born, the man who had put Gideon on his first motorcycle at the age of 12 and taught him that freedom was a two-wheeled thing that roared. The password was analog, unhackable, the kind of security measure that a man who did not trust computers would use to protect digital secrets. Nobody would think to look at the bottom of a dead boy's lighter for the key to a criminal empire. The ambush happened 5 miles north of Bodega Bay. The sun was dropping toward the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood orange, when a matte black SUV materialized from a dirt turnoff. It came up fast, slamming alongside Gideon's custom Harley at 70 miles per hour, close enough that the side mirror clipped his left elbow. The passenger window dropped. 2 muzzle flashes lit the twilight like camera strobes, brief and blinding. The first hollow point round punched through his abdomen, tearing through muscle and intestine and lodging against his spine. The second shattered his left femur just above the knee, a splintering impact that sent white-hot agony screaming up his entire left side. Gideon's massive hands locked onto the handlebars through sheer survival instinct, keeping the bike upright for another agonizing half-mile. His vision tunneled, the road blurred. The wind against his face felt cold, impossibly cold, even in the July heat. He could feel his blood running down his stomach, soaking through his jeans, pooling on the leather seat beneath him. His body was shutting down, but his hands would not let go. Not yet. Not until the SUV's headlights disappeared in his side mirror. Not until the road curved sharply to the left and his arms finally gave out. The Harley left the road at the curve, launching over the low guardrail and plunging into the deep concrete culvert below. The impact was catastrophic. The front wheel crumpled on contact with the culvert floor, the forks snapping like dry twigs. The engine died with a metallic wheeze as oil leaked onto sun-baked stone, and the fuel tank cracked, sending the sharp smell of gasoline into the still air. Gideon was thrown clear of the wreckage, his massive body rolling through the tall, dry weeds before coming to rest face up in the dirt 10 feet from the smoking remains of his motorcycle. He lay there staring at the pale California sky. The clouds were thin and high-stretched like cotton pulled apart by invisible hands. A hawk circled overhead, riding a thermal, patient and indifferent. Gideon thought about Caleb, about the phone call at 3 in the morning from a number he did not recognize, about driving to the coroner's office in Petaluma in his truck, still wearing the t-shirt he had slept in, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the steering wheel, about identifying the body, about the way his son's face had looked peaceful, almost content, as if the heroin had given him in death the ease it had promised in life, about the sound his wife made when he called in her from the parking lot afterward, a sound that started as a word and ended as something that was not language at all, something primal and shattered. She left him 2 months later. He did not blame her. He could not look at himself in the mirror either. He was ready to die. He had been ready for 14 months. The evidence on the micro SD card was supposed to be his legacy, his final act. The one thing he could do for Caleb that mattered. Destroy the people who had sold his son the poison. But the card was in his pocket, and he was dying in a ditch, and nobody was coming. Then the boy appeared. Dust devils danced along the cracked shoulder of the highway, swirling heat and silence into the late July afternoon. 7-year-old Wyatt Clark should not have been anywhere near the treacherous drop-off of Highway 1. His mother, Nora Beckett, was pulling a double shift at the diner in Bodega Bay. She had left him in the care of a teenage neighbor named Julie, who was currently asleep on the couch in front of a blaring television with her phone balanced on her chest and a bag of potato chips slowly deflating against her hip. Nora would have been furious if she had known, but Nora was always working, always running, always trying to outpace the financial wreckage left behind by a husband who had vanished 3 years ago without so much as a forwarding address. Derek Clark had been a charming man with expensive habits and a talent for cruelty that revealed itself in stages like a slow poison. He had a smile that made waitresses blush and a temper that made walls shake. By the time Nora understood what he truly was, she had a 4-year-old son, a mountain of debt, and a bruise on her ribs that took 6 weeks to fade. She left in the middle of the night. It was a Tuesday. She remembered that because the garbage trucks came on Wednesdays, and as she carried her single suitcase down the driveway with Wyatt strapped into his car seat, she had passed the trash cans she had set out earlier that evening, lined up neatly at the curb, and she had thought, "I will never take out this trash again." It was a strange thought to have while fleeing domestic violence, but the mind clings to small concrete details when the larger picture is too terrifying to hold. She drove north until the gas light came on. She ended up in Bodega Bay, a quiet coastal town where nobody asked questions and the diner was always hiring. She had trained as a registered nurse before Derek convinced her to quit, and she still carried that knowledge in her hands. Steady hands, hands that could find a vein in the dark or stop a wound from bleeding or feel the difference between a healthy pulse and one that was fading. But nursing jobs required current certifications and background checks, and Nora could not afford to leave a paper trail that Derek might follow. So she waited tables, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. She learned the regulars' names. She learned which fishermen tipped well and which tourists complained about the chowder. She learned to smile when she was exhausted and to count her tips in the bathroom during her break and to hide the cash in a tampon box under the bathroom sink because Derek had once found her emergency fund in his shoe and spent it on poker. And she kept her boys safe. Wyatt was a quiet child, not shy, quiet. The kind of quiet that came from growing up fast in a house full of tension. He had his mother's blue eyes and his father's blonde hair, and a habit of observing the world with the unblinking focus of a much older mind. He collected things, smooth river stones, jagged pieces of quartz, beetles that he would trap in a jar study for exactly one afternoon, noting the color of their shells and the number of their legs with the meticulous attention of a tiny scientist, and then release back into the grass. His plastic bucket was his most prized possession. It went everywhere with him, to the creek, to the backyard, to the edge of the property where the blackberry bushes grew thick and wild and the ground dropped steeply toward the highway. Left to his own devices that afternoon, Wyatt had wandered to the edge of the family's sprawling, unkempt property, armed with his bucket and a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich. The sandwich was his own creation, assembled with the careful imprecision of a child who had learned to make his own lunch because his mother was not always home to make it for him. Too much peanut butter, not enough jelly, the bread slightly stale. He ate it without complaint the way he did most things. He heard the impact before he saw it, a sickening metallic crunch that sounded like a giant crushing a soda can, followed by the high-pitched shriek of tearing rubber and grinding steel. The sound rolled up the embankment and through the blackberry bushes, reaching Wyatt's ears with a clarity that made him freeze mid-bite. He knew the sound of a car crash. There had been one on the highway near their house the previous winter, and his mother had run outside to help while he watched from the window. She had come back with blood on her apron and told him that sometimes people got hurt and you had to help them even when it was scary. Dropping his bucket, Wyatt scrambled through the dense thicket of blackberry bushes that separated the backyard from the steep embankment leading down to the road. The thorns tore at his denim overalls, leaving thin red scratches on his forearms, but curiosity propelled him forward. He had his mother's instinct. When something was wrong, you moved toward it, not away. When he pushed through the final layer of foliage, his blue eyes widened. A massive custom Harley-Davidson lay on its side in the deep concrete culvert, its front wheel bent at a grotesque angle, the chrome forks twisted like broken fingers. The engine was smoking and hissing as oil leaked onto the sun-baked stone, and the sharp smell of gasoline hung in the air like a warning. And 10 feet from the wreckage, half buried in the tall, dry weeds, lay a man. Wyatt approached slowly, his small sneakers crunching on gravel. The man was colossal, easily 6'4", clad in heavy black leather and denim. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, matted with sweat, and something dark and wet that Wyatt did not immediately recognize. As the boy got closer, the metallic scent of copper overpowered the smell of spilled gasoline. It was blood, more blood than Wyatt had ever seen. It was spreading across the man's white t-shirt beneath his leather vest, turning the fabric a deep, ugly crimson that looked almost black in the afternoon sun. Hearing the crunch of gravel, Gideon's survival instincts flared. Through eyes clouded with pain and blood loss, he saw a silhouette approaching. The shape was wrong, too small, but his brain, oxygen-starved and swimming in adrenaline, defaulted to the only scenario it knew. The cartel hitman had found him. They had come to finish the job. Gideon gritted his teeth and forced his trembling right hand toward the heavy Glock 19 holstered at his hip. His fingers wrapped around the textured grip. He drew the weapon, the metal feeling like it weighed 100 pounds, and leveled it at the approaching shadow. "Stop!" Gideon rasped, his voice a wet, guttural growl that sounded more animal than human. Wyatt froze. He looked at the gun. The black metal was enormous in the dying man's shaking hand, the barrel wavering in small, erratic circles. Then Wyatt looked up at the giant man's face. To Gideon's utter bewilderment, the boy did not scream. He did not run. He did not even take a step backward. He just stood there, tilting his head slightly to the right, the way a dog does when it hears a sound it does not understand, his gaze dropping from the gun to the dark spreading stain on the white t-shirt beneath the leather cut. "You're leaking," Wyatt observed, his high, innocent voice cutting through the heavy tension of the ravine like a bell struck in an empty church. Gideon blinked. His vision cleared just enough to realize he was pointing a loaded firearm at a child, a kid with tousled blonde hair wearing dirt-smudged overalls and holding a half-eaten sandwich in his left hand. The gun trembled. For one terrible second, the image of Caleb at that age flashed through Gideon's failing mind. The same blonde hair, the same fearless stare, the same stubborn refusal to be afraid of things that should have terrified him. With a groan that tore through his chest, Gideon let his arm drop. The gun tumbled from his grip into the dirt, landing with a dull thud among the weeds. "Kid!" Gideon choked out, coughing up a spatter of blood that landed on his beard and chin. "Get out of here. It ain't safe." "My mom says I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," Wyatt replied reasonably, taking a small step closer instead of retreating. "But she also says if someone is hurt, you have to help them. Are you a bad guy?" Gideon let out a harsh, breathless laugh that immediately turned into a wince of agonizing pain. He looked down at his leather vest adorned with the infamous winged death's head patch and the rockers that declared him a patch member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. To most of the world, he was the definition of a bad guy. He had broken bones for the club. He had collected debts with his fists. He had spent 2 years in Pelican Bay State Prison for assault with a deadly weapon. He was the man that mothers warned their children about, the dark shape on the highway that decent people crossed the street to avoid. "Yeah, kid," Gideon whispered, his eyelids growing incredibly heavy. "I'm a bad guy. Now run along. Go call the cops." Even as he said it, Gideon knew the police would be his death sentence. If he went to a hospital under police watch, the cartel would have him assassinated in his bed before midnight. There was a leak in the local precinct. He had known it for months. A detective named Marcus Holloway, a decorated 15-year veteran with a closet full of commendations and a soul that had been purchased in installments by Vincent Mercer's syndicate. Holloway had access to every police database, every hospital record, every piece of information that would tell the cartel exactly where Gideon was and how to reach him. But Gideon was dying, and he could not let a child watch him bleed out in a ditch. Wyatt stepped closer, kneeling beside the massive biker. The boy's small, uncalloused hands reached out, hesitating for a second over the bloody leather before pressing down on the vest right over the worst of the bleeding. The wound was hot and wet beneath his palms, and the sensation should have been horrifying. But Wyatt had seen his mother do this once, leaning over a man who had cut his hand on a broken glass at the diner, applying pressure with the bar towel while she calmly instructed someone to call for an ambulance. Pressure stops the leaking. That was what she had said. I don't have a phone, Wyatt said, applying his meager body weight to the wound. And my babysitter is asleep. You need a Band-Aid, a really big one. Gideon hissed as the pressure sent a fresh wave of blinding agony through his torso, but it also forced a surge of adrenaline into his system, keeping him tethered to consciousness by the thinnest of threads. He looked at the boy, truly looked at him. There was no fear in Wyatt's eyes, only a stubborn, innocent determination. The same look Caleb used to get when he was trying to fix a bicycle chain or catch a frog in the creek behind their old house in Healdsburg. The look of a child who had decided that something needed to be done and was going to do it regardless of whether the world agreed. Listen to me. Gideon breathed, his hand weakly grabbing Wyatt's small wrist. The boy's bones felt impossibly delicate beneath his blood-slicked fingers, like holding a bird. You can't call the cops. They come, I die. You understand? Wyatt frowned, clearly confused by the logic. In his 7 years of experience, the police were the people you called when something was wrong. They wore uniforms and drove cars with lights on top, and they fixed things. The idea that calling them could make things worse did not compute. But he nodded slowly, trusting the urgency in the dying man's voice. Okay, no cops. Who do I call? Gideon felt the cold numbness creeping up his legs, a sure sign that his body was shutting down. The California sun was beating down on them, pressing its heat against his face and chest, but he felt freezing, as if winter had crawled inside his bones and settled there. He had minutes, maybe less. Inside, Gideon gasped, struggling to find the breath. Inside my cut, left pocket. Your what? My vest, the leather, inside pocket. Wyatt leaned over the giant man, his small hands fumbling with the heavy sweat-soaked leather. The smell of blood leather and stale cigarette smoke was overwhelming, a dense adult smell that had no place in the sensory world of a 7-year-old. But Wyatt focused on the task. He found the inside pocket by feel, pushing his small fingers into the dark opening. His hand closed around a thick, rectangular object, and he pulled out a cheap, heavy-duty prepaid cell phone, the kind sold at gas stations in blister packs. Got it, Wyatt said, holding it up. Speed dial number 1. Gideon instructed, his eyes slipping shut. He forced them open again through sheer force of will, fighting the darkness that was closing in from the edges of his vision like a curtain being drawn. Tell him iron is down. Highway 1, past the old dairy farm. Tell him the code word. Gideon coughed, a violent spasm that racked his massive frame and sent fresh blood streaming from the corner of his mouth. Code word. Broken spoke. Wyatt pressed the number 1 on the keypad and hit the green call button. He lifted the phone to his ear, his other hand still pressing down stubbornly on Gideon's bleeding stomach. The phone rang twice before it was answered. There was no hello, just the sound of heavy breathing and loud rock music playing in the background, the bass so deep it vibrated through the phone's tiny speaker. Talk, a deep, gravelly voice demanded on the other end. It was Arthur Brick Dalton, the chapter sergeant-at-arms, a man whose reputation for violence was legendary across the West Coast. He was a man who had once broken a rival's jaw with a single punch, who had served 6 years in San Quentin for armed robbery, and who answered his phone the same way he answered the door, with a challenge. Hi, Wyatt said politely. I'm calling for iron. He's leaking. There was a dead, heavy silence on the line. The rock music in the background was suddenly muted. The quality of the silence changed, becoming dense and electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. Who the hell is this? Brick's voice dropped an octave, turning instantly menacing. "Where did you get this phone? Where is Gideon?" "He's in the ditch," Wyatt explained, looking down at the pale, sweating face of the biker. "He fell off his motorcycle. He said to tell you he is down on Highway 1 past the dairy farm." Wyatt paused, his brow furrowing as he tried to remember the strange phrase. He had heard it clearly, but it was an unusual combination of words, the kind of thing adults said that did not make sense to a child. And he said, "broken spoke." The shift on the other end of the line was instantaneous. The sheer terror of hearing the emergency code word from the mouth of a child hit the hardened biker like a physical blow. Broken spoke was not just a phrase. It was the club's most extreme distress signal, reserved for situations where a member was in mortal danger and could not save himself. It had been used exactly 3 times in the chapter's 40-year history. Every time it meant someone was about to die. "Kid, listen to me very carefully," Brick said, his voice stripped of its previous anger, replaced by a cold, urgent precision that left no room for misunderstanding. "Is Gideon awake?" Wyatt looked down. Gideon's eyes were closed, his breathing incredibly shallow and erratic, each breath accompanied by a wet, rattling sound that came from somewhere deep inside his chest. "He's sleeping now, but he's bleeding a whole lot. I'm pressing on it like they do on TV, but it's not stopping." "Keep pressing, kid. Do not stop pressing," Brick commanded. "We are coming. 5 minutes. Do not leave him. What's your name, Wyatt?" "All right, Wyatt, you're a brave boy. Hold the line. I'm coming to get him." The call disconnected. Wyatt set the phone down in the dirt, placing both of his small hands on Gideon's stomach, leaning his upper body over the man to apply as much weight as his 70-pound frame could muster. The blood was warm between his fingers. It kept coming no matter how hard he pressed, seeping between his knuckles and running down the backs of his hands. But he did not lift his palms. He did not shift his weight. He stayed exactly where he was, the way his mother had taught him, because when someone was leaking, you pressed, and you did not stop. Beneath him, Gideon stirred. The biker's hand twitched, moving slowly toward his own right pants pocket. He was slipping away, his consciousness dimming like a lamp running out of oil, but his mind clung to the one thing that mattered more than his life. The reason the cartel had hit him. The reason he could not trust the police. In his pocket was the heavy silver Zeppo lighter, Caleb's lighter. The casing held the encrypted micro SD card containing the cartel's shipping manifest, dirty cops on the payroll, and the coordinates of every drop house between Oakland and the Oregon border. It was the leverage the club needed to wipe the rival syndicate off the map, and it was the last thing his dead son had ever touched. Gideon had given Caleb the lighter on his 18th birthday. It had been his own father's, passed down through 2 generations of men who rode motorcycles and lived outside the lines society drew for acceptable behavior. Caleb had carried it everywhere, even though he did not smoke. He carried it the way some people carry a photograph or a St. Christopher medal, as a talisman, as proof that he belonged to something larger than himself. When the coroner returned Caleb's personal effects in a sealed plastic bag, the lighter was inside, along with a wallet containing $7 and a driver's license that was 3 months old. Gideon had taken the lighter and left everything else. If the cartel found his body first, they would take it. If the cops found him, the dirty badges would bury it. With agonizing slowness, Gideon dragged the heavy silver lighter from his pocket. He looked at the boy, this innocent kid who had stumbled into a war zone. It was a terrible risk, pulling a civilian child into this darkness. But Gideon had no other play, no other option, no other hope. "Wyatt," Gideon whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that had begun to pick up, carrying the smell of salt and eucalyptus from the coast. Wyatt leaned down his ear close to Gideon's mouth. I'm still here, Mr. Iron. Gideon slipped the silver Zippo into the deep front pocket of Wyatt's denim overalls. His massive blood-stained hand patted the boy's pocket once, feeling the weight settle against the child's small thigh. Keep it safe, Gideon breathed. Don't tell anyone. Not the cops, not your mom, only Brick. Okay, Wyatt whispered back, feeling the heavy metal weight against his thigh. I promise. Gideon offered a weak, bloody smile. The boy's blue eyes stared down at him, and for one fleeting moment, Gideon saw Caleb. Not the wasted body on the coroner's table. Not the gaunt, hollow-eyed teenager who had stopped returning his phone calls in the months before the overdose. The real Caleb, 7 years old, kneeling beside a broken bicycle in the afternoon sun, refusing to give up until the chain was fixed. Blonde hair falling across his forehead, tongue sticking out in concentration. The same stubborn determination that Gideon saw now in the eyes of a stranger's child. Good boy, Gideon sighed. And then Gideon Blackwell's head rolled to the side. His chest stopped heaving. His body went completely limp, sinking deeper into the dry weeds as if the earth itself was pulling him down. Mr. Iron. Wyatt shook the man's shoulder, panic finally beginning to crack his calm demeanor. Mr. Iron, wake up. The boy shook harder. The giant man did not respond. His chest was still. His face was slack. The blood had stopped spreading across his shirt, which Wyatt somehow understood was not a good sign. From the north, cutting through the stillness of the afternoon, came the wail of police sirens. Someone driving on the highway must have finally noticed the skid marks and the broken guardrail and called 911. But from the south, roaring up Highway 1 like a mechanical thunderstorm, came a different sound. The thunderous, deafening roar of a dozen Harley-Davidson V-twin engines running at maximum RPM, a sound so deep and powerful it vibrated in the bones and shook the dust from the weeds. Wyatt stood up in the ditch, his hands stained crimson, looking left toward the approaching flashing blue and red lights, and right toward the black swarm of motorcycles cresting the hill. The race was on, and a 7-year-old boy holding the deadliest secret in California was caught directly in the middle. Dust plumed into the air like a localized explosion as 14 heavy Harley-Davidson motorcycles locked their brakes, sliding into a tactical formation along the crumbling shoulder of Highway 1. They arrived mere seconds before the Sonoma County Sheriff's cruisers, effectively creating a wall of steel and black leather between the highway and the ravine. The engines idled in a unified growl, the combined vibration strong enough to ripple the stagnant air. Leading the pack was Arthur Brick Dalton. He did not bother using the kickstand. He practically threw his motorcycle to the gravel and vaulted down the steep embankment, his heavy boots crushing the dry mustard weeds with each long, powerful stride. Close behind him were 3 of the chapter's most hardened members. Hank Schaefer, a rangy Montana transplant with a sniper's patience and a hunting rifle slung across his back. Eddie Knuckles Gallagher, a broad-shouldered Irishman from Oakland, whose hands had been broken so many times the bones had healed into permanent, misshapen clubs. And a towering prospect named Cole, barely 22, eager and terrified in equal measure. Brick hit the bottom of the ditch and froze. The sight before him was something out of a nightmare he had not known he could have. Gideon, a man who had survived bar brawls, prison riots, and a decade of cartel wars, lay lifeless in the dirt. His skin was the color of old wax. His leather cut was soaked through with blood. And straddling his massive chest, applying pressure with hands stained entirely red, was a small boy in overalls. Wyatt! Brick's voice was uncharacteristically gentle, a stark contrast to his intimidating, scarred visage. He was not a man who spoke gently. He was a man who gave orders and expected them to be followed. But the sight of the child, the sheer impossibility of what this boy was doing, stripped the hardness from his voice like sandpaper on rough wood. Wyatt looked up, his blue eyes wide but shockingly clear. "Are you Broken?" spoke. "I'm Brick, kid. You called me." The sergeant at arms knelt in the blood-soaked dirt, gently wrapping his large calloused hands over Wyatt's small ones, taking over the pressure. The boy's hands were warm and slippery beneath his, and Brick could feel the faint, thready pulse of Gideon's heartbeat through the layers of leather and muscle and torn tissue. "You did real good. You can let go now." Wyatt stumbled back, wiping a spot of sweat from his forehead and leaving a stark crimson smear across his pale skin. He looked at his hands, turning them over, examining the blood that had dried in the creases of his palms and beneath his fingernails. It did not seem real. It looked like the kind of paint his mother let him use on Sunday afternoons, the washable kind that came off in the bath. Before Brick could check Gideon's pulse properly, the shrill chirp of police sirens cut off abruptly, replaced by the slamming of car doors and the frantic shouting of law enforcement. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. We have a 1050 major, possible 1072. Multiple hostile subjects on scene. Send backup and an RA unit immediately." Sheriff Deputy David Miller, barely a year out of the academy, stood at the top of the ridge with his hand hovering nervously over his service weapon. His face was flushed. His eyes were too wide. He was a young man who had been trained for traffic stops and domestic disputes, and he was staring down at a scene that looked like a war zone. But it was not Miller that made Brick's blood run cold. It was the man climbing out of the unmarked sedan behind the cruiser, Detective Marcus Holloway. Holloway was the reason Gideon had been riding alone. He was the leak, the cartel's highest paid asset inside the county precinct. A man who had spent 15 years building a reputation for competence and integrity while systematically selling every piece of intelligence that crossed his desk to Vincent Mercer's organization. He had a wife in Petaluma, a daughter at Berkeley, a pension fund that looked healthy on paper, and an offshore account in the Caymans that held considerably more than his government salary could explain. "Back away from the victim, Dalton," Holloway barked, sliding down the embankment with his badge held high in his left hand, his right hand resting on the butt of his holstered service weapon. His eyes were not looking at Gideon. They were scanning the wreckage of the motorcycle sweeping across the disturbed weeds, searching for something specific. "This is a crime scene." Brick did not move. He kept his hands pressed hard against Gideon's abdomen, feeling the faintest thready thrum of a heartbeat. Barely there, a whisper of life in a body that had already given up. "He's barely breathing, Holloway. Where's the damn ambulance?" "It's on the way," Holloway snapped. The detective's gaze swept over Gideon's leather, cut his eyes locking onto the open, empty inner pocket with the intensity of a man watching his own house burn. The micro SD card was not there. If Gideon had ditched it somewhere in the brush, Holloway would need a search team in time, neither which he had. If the cartel learned the card was in the wind, they would hold Holloway personally responsible. And Mercer's definition of accountability did not involve performance reviews. Then the detective's cold gaze landed on the 7-year-old boy standing a few feet away, covered in the biker's blood. "Who's the kid?" Holloway demanded, taking a step toward Wyatt. "Son, did this man give you anything? Did he drop anything before we got here?" Wyatt felt the heavy weight of the silver Zippo burning against his thigh in the deep pocket of his overalls. He remembered the giant biker's dying breath, the warmth of the bloody hand pressing the lighter into his pocket, the whispered instructions. "Don't tell anyone. Not the cops." "He gave me a scare," Wyatt said, his voice trembling just enough to sound like a terrified child. "He fell down and started leaking. I tried to plug the holes. Detective! A frantic voice pierced the tension. Nora Beckett, still wearing her diner apron and a look of sheer terror, was scrambling down the thorny embankment, ignoring the warnings of Deputy Miller. Someone at the diner had heard the dispatch call on the scanner behind the counter and recognized the cross streets. Nora had dropped the coffee pot she was holding, left it shattered on the floor behind the register, and driven the 3 miles to the crash site at a speed that would have earned her a citation if every available officer had not already been at the scene. She reached the bottom of the embankment, and the world narrowed to a single point. Her son standing in a drainage ditch, covered head to toe in blood. Nora felt her knees buckle. The breath left her body. For one horrifying second, a second that would replay in her nightmares for years, she believed the blood was his. That something had happened to Wyatt. That the worst thing, the thing she guarded against with every lock and every prayer and every double shift, had finally come for her. Then Wyatt turned toward her, and she saw his eyes. Clear, focused, uninjured. She snatched him into her arms, burying her face in his blonde hair, her body convulsing with the kind of sob that starts in the stomach and claws its way up through the chest like an animal trying to escape. Wyatt, oh my God, you're covered in blood. Ma'am, I need to ask your son a few questions. Holloway pressed his tone, lacking any empathy. It was the voice of a man on a deadline. Nora's head snapped up. She had spent 3 years married to a man who used that exact tone. The flat, reasonable voice that meant unreasonable things were about to happen. The voice that said, "I'm not angry, I just need you to listen," right before the anger arrived. Her arms tightened around Wyatt. Brick stood up, his massive frame deliberately blocking Holloway's path to the mother and child. Hank and Knuckles stepped up beside him, silently forming a wall of leather and muscle 3 men wide. The kid just watched a man bleed out, Holloway. Brick growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You want to interrogate a traumatized 7-year-old? Do it at the station with his mother and a lawyer present. Right now, back the hell off. The wail of the approaching ambulance broke the stalemate. Paramedics swarmed the ditch, pushing past the bikers and the cops with the practiced urgency of people who dealt with dying men every day. They loaded Gideon onto a backboard, started 2 large-bore IVs, and hoisted the massive biker up the ridge on a stretcher that sagged under his weight. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Brick locked eyes with Wyatt over Nora's shoulder. Brick gave the boy a single imperceptible nod, a gesture so small that no one else in the ravine would have noticed it. Wyatt, his face buried in his mother's shoulder, blinked back. The secret was safe. But as Holloway watched the boy being carried away by his mother, his eyes narrowed into dangerous, calculating slits. The detective knew Gideon had not had time to hide the drive in the brush. The crash site was too exposed. The only person who had been alone with the biker was the kid. The Beckett household was a modest single-story ranch house surrounded by towering redwood trees, situated a lonely 3 miles from the crash site. By 9 o'clock that evening, adrenaline had worn off, leaving the house in a state of exhausted silence. The summer twilight had faded into a warm, still darkness, and the redwoods stood like black sentinels against a sky full of stars. Nora had scrubbed Wyatt in the bathtub 3 times to get the dried blood out from under his fingernails. She used her nursing hands, thorough and gentle, working the soap into every crease and fold while Wyatt sat quietly in the warm water, watching the pink-tinged suds swirl around the drain. She had tried to keep her voice calm, tried to ask the right questions without pressing too hard. She knew the look on Wyatt's face, the same look he used to get when Derek was shouting in the next room. Not fear exactly, something quieter, a 7-year-old's version of strategic silence. The look of a child who had learned that there are times when the safest thing to say is nothing at all. She made him a mug of hot cocoa and tucked him into bed with the promise that the bad things were over. She kissed his forehead and closed the bedroom door. Then she walked into the kitchen, leaned against the counter, and allowed herself exactly 60 seconds to fall apart. She pressed both hands over her mouth and cried without making a sound. It was a skill she had perfected during her marriage. The silent cry, the one that left no evidence, no red eyes, no swollen nose, just the taste of salt and the shaking in her hands that took 20 minutes to subside. She wiped her eyes, checked the deadbolt on the front door, checked the lock on the back door, checked the windows. Nora Beckett was a woman who had learned through painful experience that safety was not a state of being. It was a series of locks. It was a chain of actions performed in sequence every night without variation, because the one night you skipped a step was the night the door opened. But Wyatt was not asleep. The moment his mother closed his bedroom door, he slipped out from under his superhero bed sheets. He pulled his dirty, blood-stained overalls from the plastic laundry bag Nora had shoved into the corner. Reaching deep into the right pocket, his fingers closed around the cold, heavy metal of the silver Zippo lighter. It felt important. It felt dangerous. The way a loaded word feels dangerous before you understand what it means. He turned it over in his small hands, studying it in the thin moonlight filtering through the window blinds. The silver was warm from being inside the pocket all day, and it carried a faint smell that Wyatt associated with the man in the ditch: blood and smoke and leather. On the bottom of the lighter, scratched deep into the polished silver, was something sharp or strange markings, letters and numbers. He could not read all of them in the dark, but he tried to memorize the shapes. A tall letter, then smaller letters, a line, numbers, a mark at the end that looked like a stick with a dot. He needed a hiding spot. The toy chest was too obvious. Under the mattress was where people in movies always looked. His eyes landed on his plastic collection bucket on the windowsill, filled to the brim with smooth river stones, jagged pieces of quartz and dirt. Working quietly, Wyatt dug a deep hole in the center of the rocks, placed the silver lighter inside, and buried it completely, smoothing the stones over the top until the surface looked undisturbed. He stepped back and examined his work. Good. Nobody would look for a lighter in a bucket of rocks. Just as he finished, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway echoed through the quiet night. Wyatt crept to his window and peered through the blinds. A dark, unmarked sedan was parked outside. The engine cut off, and Detective Marcus Holloway stepped out into the moonlight. He was not wearing his suit jacket. He wore a tight black t-shirt, and his service weapon was clearly visible unholstered and held casually in his right hand down by his leg. His face was set in a hard expression, the jaw muscles working, and his eyes swept across the front of the house with the focused intensity of a man who was not here to ask questions. A sharp, authoritative knock hammered on the front door. Wyatt cracked his bedroom door open, listening as his mother's hesitant footsteps approached the entryway. "Who is it?" Nora called out, the deadbolt still locked. "Detective Holloway, Ms. Beckett, Sonoma County Sheriff's Office. We met at the crash site today." "Detective, it's late. Wyatt is asleep. Can this wait until tomorrow?" "I'm afraid not, ma'am." Holloway's voice was smooth but laced with an underlying threat that Nora recognized the way a dog recognizes the sound of a belt being pulled from its loops. "There are some inconsistencies with the crime scene. We believe the victim may have dropped a dangerous narcotic substance near your property. I need to speak with the boy to ensure he didn't pick anything up, for his own safety." The mention of narcotics was precisely calibrated. Nora stood in the dark hallway, her hand on the deadbolt. Every instinct she had built over 3 years of running from a dangerous man told her not to open that door. The voice on the other side was too smooth, too insistent, too familiar. It had the same cadence Derek used to use when he explained why she needed to hand over her car keys or her phone or her bank card. The reasonable tone that preceded unreasonable demands. But the word narcotics hit differently when you had a 7-year-old son who had spent the afternoon covered in a stranger's blood. What if there were drugs at the scene? What if Wyatt had touched something toxic? What if there was fentanyl on his skin and she had missed it during the bath and it was absorbing through his pores right now while he slept? Nora's nursing training fought against her survival instincts and the nurse won. She undid the deadbolt. Holloway stepped into the small living room, his eyes scanning the space like a predator entering a new enclosure. He slipped his gun back into its holster, but kept his hand resting on the grip. His gaze cataloged every surface, the bookshelf with its paperback novels and framed photographs, the worn couch with the Afghan draped over the back, the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Every child height hiding spot where a 7-year-old might stash something he was not supposed to have. Where is he? I'll go wake him, Nora said, already regretting the open door. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her stomach, a cold knot that tightened with every second this man stood in her home. The way he looked at her house was not the way a detective looked at a concerned citizen's residence. It was the way a thief cased a target. But she did not have to wake Wyatt. The boy stepped out of the hallway in his pajamas, staring at the detective with an expression that was far too composed for a child his age. "Hello, Wyatt." Holloway smiled, a terrifying expression that did not reach his eyes. He knelt down to the boy's eye level, placing himself between Wyatt and the front door. "I need you to be very honest with me. That biker today, he had a silver lighter. Did he give it to you?" "No, sir." Wyatt lied without blinking. And Nora noticed. She noticed because she had spent years learning to read faces for the difference between truth and performance. She had become an expert in the micro-expressions of deception, trained by a husband who lied about everything from where he had been to how much he had spent to whether he had hit her or whether she had simply fallen. Wyatt's voice was steady. His eyes did not dart. He was lying and he was good at it, and that realization sent a chill through Nora that had nothing to do with the detective standing in her living room. Holloway's smile vanished. He glanced at Nora. "Ms. Beckett, could you fetch me a glass of water? It's been a long night." Nora hesitated. Every alarm bell in her body was screaming. The request was designed to separate her from her son, and she recognized the technique because Derek used to do the same thing. Send her to the kitchen or the bedroom or the garage so that he could have a private conversation with whatever person he needed to intimidate. But she nodded and stepped into the adjoining kitchen. She pulled a glass from the cabinet, turned on the faucet, and then she heard it. A small sound, almost nothing. The faint rustle of fabric being grabbed, and a tiny catch in Wyatt's breathing, a sound she knew as well as her own heartbeat. Nora set the glass down on the counter. She reached for the knife block. In the living room, Holloway had dropped the facade. He gripped Wyatt by the collar of his pajama shirt, pulling the boy close, his face inches from the child's, his breath smelling of stale coffee and peppermint. "Listen to me, you little brat," Holloway hissed. "I know he gave it to you. If you don't hand it over right now, I'm going to arrest your mother. I'm going to put her in jail forever, and you're going to an orphanage. Where is it?" Wyatt's heart hammered against his ribs. Tears welled in his eyes. The threat against his mother hit him exactly where he was most vulnerable, in the place where his entire world was built. His mother was everything. She was the one who made him hot cocoa and checked under the bed for monsters and sang to him in the car when the radio was broken. The idea of her being taken away locked behind bars was a horror so vast that it overwhelmed every other thought in his head. His mouth opened. He was about to speak, about to give up the location of the rocks. Nora came around the corner with a 10-inch chef's knife in her right hand. She did not scream. She did not threaten. She simply placed herself in between the detective and her son, the blade held low and angled outward, her stance wider than it should have been for a woman who claimed to have no combat training. But Nora Beckett had lived with a violent man for 3 years. She had learned exactly where to stand and exactly how to hold a knife so that anyone coming forward would have to go through steel first. She had practiced it in her mind 1,000 times during her marriage, lying in bed at night, mentally rehearsing the steps she would take if Derek ever went too far. She had never had to use it, until now. "Take your hands off my son." Nora's voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of a woman who had made peace with the worst possible outcome a long time ago. "And then you are going to walk out that door, because if you don't, I am going to call 911, and then I am going to call the Sonoma County Register, and then I am going to call every news station between here and San Francisco. And I promise you, detective, a story about a cop threatening a 7-year-old at 10 o'clock at night will be on every screen in California by morning." Holloway released Wyatt's collar. He straightened up, his jaw tight, calculating the risk. The woman was not bluffing. He could see it in her eyes. She had the look of someone who had already been through worse and survived. The look of someone who had nothing left to lose except the child behind her. Before Holloway could respond, the deafening roar of a V-twin engine shattered the quiet of the neighborhood. A blinding white headlight illuminated the living room through the front window, casting long, menacing shadows across the walls that stretched and twisted like dark fingers reaching across the ceiling. Someone kicked the heavy oak front door. It did not open. It splintered off its hinges, crashing violently onto the living room rug in a shower of wood fragments and broken hardware. Brick Dalton stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the headlight of his idling motorcycle. In his right hand, he held a sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun, the barrel resting casually against his thigh. He stepped over the ruined door, his boots thudding heavily on the hardwood floor. He was 6'3" and 240 pounds, and in the harsh white light from the motorcycle's headlamp, the tattoos that covered his arms and neck looked like war paint. Holloway instantly drew his service weapon, aiming it squarely at the biker's chest. Nora pulled Wyatt behind her, the knife still in her hand, her body a shield between her child and every threat in the room. Two drawn weapons, a child, a mother with a blade. The living room of a small ranch house had become a powder keg with 3 lit fuses. Brick looked at the knife in Nora's hand, then at Holloway's drawn weapon, then at the tear streaks on Wyatt's face. Something dark and ancient shifted behind the biker's eyes. The kind of anger that does not shout, the kind that goes quiet. "I heard the Becketts had a rat problem," Brick said, his voice echoing in the small room. "Came to help exterminate." "You're out of your jurisdiction, biker," Holloway snarled, his hands shaking slightly, the barrel of his service weapon tracing small circles in the air. "You pull that trigger, you free." "I don't need to pull the trigger, Amon," Brick replied calmly, taking one deliberate step forward. The floorboards creaked under his weight. "My brothers are currently paying a visit to your ex-wife's house in Petaluma and your daughter's dorm room at Berkeley. You pull that trigger, they get a phone call." Holloway's face drained of color. Whatever defiance was left in his expression evaporated, replaced by the raw animal terror of a man who has just realized that the rules he was playing by no longer apply. He lowered his gun a fraction of an inch. You're a dead man, Dalton, Holloway whispered. Maybe, Brick conceded, but you're leaving this house right now, and you're never coming within 50 miles of this kid or his mother again. Because if you do, the club will make what the cartel does look like a damn tea party. Holloway weighed his options. He was outgunned, outmaneuvered, and his family was exposed. The calculation took less than 3 seconds. With a furious curse, he holstered his weapon, sidestepped Brick, and stormed out the shattered doorway. The sound of his sedan peeling out of the driveway tires screaming on gravel signaled his retreat. Brick slowly lowered the hammer on his shotgun. He turned to face Nora, who had not lowered the knife. She stood in the narrow hallway, Wyatt pressed against her back, the 10-inch blade still angled outward. Her hand was not shaking. Her eyes were dry. Brick looked at the knife. He looked at the woman holding it. He had spent his life around people who fought for a living, and he recognized the stance. Not trained, learned. The hard way. The way you learn to swim when someone throws you in the deep end. Ma'am, Brick said softly, removing his leather gloves and tucking them into his vest. I am truly sorry about your door. We'll have a crew here in an hour to fix it, but right now I need to talk to your son. Nora did not move for a long moment. She studied the massive biker with the same unflinching assessment she had once used to evaluate patients in the emergency room. Threat level, vital signs, intent, the set of his shoulders, the position of the shotgun, the softness in his voice that did not match the violence of his entrance. You saved us from that cop, Nora said. It was not a question. I did. Why? Because your son saved my brother today, and because that cop works for the people who tried to kill him. Nora processed this, the knife lowered by 1 inch. My name is Arthur Dalton. People call me Brick. The man your son saved, Gideon, is my brother, and Detective Holloway is on the payroll of the syndicate that wants Gideon dead. I don't understand any of this. Nora said, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her. The splintered door on the floor, the smell of motorcycle exhaust drifting in through the ruined entryway, the massive armed man standing in her living room. We don't have anything to do with gangs or cartels. Please, just leave us alone. I wish I could. Brick sighed, running a heavy ringed hand over his shaved head. But Holloway knows Wyatt was alone with Gideon. That means Holloway believes Wyatt has something that belongs to them. And those people, they don't take no for an answer, and they don't care about collateral damage. Nora felt Wyatt's small hand grip the back of her shirt. She felt the warmth of his body against her spine. She thought about the deadbolt she had checked, the windows she had locked, the illusion of safety she had built in this quiet house by the highway. She thought about Derek, about the night she had packed one suitcase and driven north until the gaslight came on. She had done it before. She could do it again. The muscle memory of escape was still in her body, coded into her nerves and her hands, and the way she calculated distances and exits. Wyatt, Nora said, not taking her eyes off Brick. Did that man give you something? A long pause. The only sound was the idling motorcycle outside and the distant chirping of crickets in the redwood grove. Then Wyatt stepped out from behind his mother. He looked up at Brick with an expression that was equal parts trust and calculation. He said only to tell you. The boy walked down the hallway to his bedroom. He returned a moment later holding the heavy silver Zippo lighter. He placed it in Brick's massive outstretched palm. Brick took the lighter and felt the world shift beneath his boots. He recognized it instantly. Caleb's lighter, the one Gideon had carried every day since his son's funeral, the one he touched compulsively when he was thinking, turning it over and over in his calloused hands the way a monk handles prayer beads. Brick's throat tightened. He flipped the lid open. He did not strike the flint. Instead, he gripped the chimney and pulled upward with a sharp tug. The entire inner casing slid out of the silver shell. Tucked into the bottom padding, wrapped in a tiny piece of clear plastic, was a black micro SD card, no bigger than a fingernail. Brick stared at it. This tiny piece of plastic was the black book of the Mercer Syndicate. Offshore bank account numbers totaling tens of millions. Shipping manifests for illegal armaments flowing through the port of Oakland. The names of every corrupt judge, politician, and police officer on Vincent Mercer's payroll, including Detective Marcus Holloway. If the police recovered it, the corrupt officers would destroy it. If the club kept it, they could dismantle their rivals permanently and clear their own names from a string of framed indictments. And Gideon had hidden it inside his dead son's lighter. Christ almighty, Brick muttered, slipping the tiny card into a secure zipper pocket inside his cut. He looked up at Nora. The knife was finally at her side. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She had made her decision the moment Wyatt handed over the lighter. She was in it now. There was no going back. Miss Beckett, you need to pack a bag. Close for 3 days. Any medications you or the boy need, nothing else. Nora did not argue. She did not cry. She did not ask where they were going or why or for how long. She simply said, give me 10 minutes. She set the knife on the kitchen counter. She walked to her bedroom and pulled a duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. The same duffel bag she had packed the night she left Derek. She had never fully unpacked it. The bag still had a toothbrush and a change of underwear and $40 in small bills tucked into the side pocket. She added clothes, grabbed Wyatt's inhaler from the bathroom cabinet, his allergy medication, a bottle of children's Tylenol. The habits of a nurse and a mother combined into a single efficient packing routine that took exactly 8 minutes. Brick watched her go, then looked down at Wyatt. The boy stood in the hallway, his pajamas wrinkled, his blue eyes fixed on the giant biker with an expression that was entirely too old for his face. Mr. Brick, yeah, Wyatt. Mom's gonna be okay, right? Brick knelt slowly, wincing as his bad knee popped. He rested his massive tattooed hand on the boy's shoulder. Your mom's the toughest person in this house, kid, and that's saying something because I'm standing in it. Wyatt smiled. It was the first time he had smiled since finding the man in the ditch. 10 minutes later, Nora emerged with the duffel bag wearing jeans and a dark sweater. She had changed out of her diner apron. She had pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail. She had put on the boots she kept by the back door, the ones with a good tread that she could run in if she needed to. She had done all of this before, the muscle memory of escape. Wyatt was dressed and ready, and his plastic bucket of rocks clutched in his arms. You can't bring that, buddy, Nora said gently. I need it, Mom. Something in his voice stopped her. She looked at the bucket, then at her son, then she nodded. Okay, let's go. Outside, a blacked-out SUV idled in the driveway, flanked by 8 heavy motorcycles. Hank Schaefer sat behind the wheel, his face grim. Nora strapped Wyatt into the back seat and climbed in beside him. The leather interior smelled like gun oil and aftershave. As the convoy pulled out of the driveway and onto the dark coastal highway, Nora looked back through the rear window at the small ranch house, disappearing behind the redwood trees. The porch light was still on. She had forgotten to turn it off. She would never see that house again. 60 miles south in a sprawling glass-walled penthouse overlooking the San Francisco Bay, Vincent Mercer was pouring himself a glass of 18-year-old Macallan. Mercer was a man of refined tastes and brutal methods. He wore bespoke Italian suits, collected rare violins, and orchestrated the deaths of his enemies with the clinical detachment of an accountant balancing a ledger. His penthouse was decorated in shades of charcoal and cream, with floor-to-ceiling windows that frame the city skyline like a painting commissioned by a man who believed he owned the view. He listened to Detective Holloway's frantic voice over the encrypted phone line. Dalton was there, Mr. Mercer. He kicked the door in. He had a shotgun. I couldn't engage without putting my family at risk. The bikers have the boy, and they likely have the drive. Mercer took a slow sip of his scotch, letting the burns settle in his chest. Let me understand this perfectly, Marcus. A 7-year-old child outsmarted you, a decorated detective, and his mother held you off with a kitchen knife, and then handed our entire financial infrastructure to a gang of motorcycle enthusiasts. It wasn't like that. It is exactly like that. Mercer cut him off, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. You have failed me, Marcus, and you know how I handle failure. Mercer pressed a button on his desk console. The heavy oak doors of his office opened, and Dominic Thorne walked in. Thorne, known in the underworld simply as Ghost, was a former private military contractor who had found a more lucrative career erasing problems for men like Mercer. He was dressed in tactical black, his face an expressionless mask that gave away nothing. He had the build of a man who maintained his fitness with the same discipline he applied to eliminating targets methodically, consistently, without emotion. Dominic Mercer said, not looking up from his glass, the angels have the drive. They also have a civilian woman and a child. I want the drive recovered. I want the bikers burned to ash. And I want the civilians silenced. No loose ends. Understood, Thorne nodded crisply. Do it quickly, Mercer commanded, before they figure out how to decrypt that file. Thorne turned to leave. At the door, Mercer called out, Dominic, one more thing. Mercer swirled his scotch, staring at the city lights reflected in the amber liquid. Gideon Blackwell lost his son to our product last year. Heroin, 19 years old. That's what started all of this. That's what gave him the motivation to spend a year building a case against me. Mercer smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. Isn't that poetic? My business killed his child, and now a different child is trying to kill my business. Thorne said nothing. He walked out into the night. The convoy roared south through the darkness. The headlights of 8 Harleys cutting through the coastal fog like searchlights. Inside the SUV, Wyatt had fallen asleep against Nora's shoulder, his plastic bucket of rocks wedged between his knees. Nora stared out the window at the black Pacific, one hand resting on her son's head, the other pressed flat against the cold glass. She did not know where they were going. She did not know who these men truly were. She only knew that a corrupt detective had grabbed her son by the collar and a tattooed biker had broken down her door to stop it. The world had turned upside down in the space of 12 hours, and the only compass Nora had left was the steady rhythm of her son's breathing. They turned inland at Santa Cruz, climbing a winding one-lane dirt road into the mountains. The redwoods closed overhead like a tunnel, and the fog thickened until the headlights were useless beyond 20 feet. After 40 minutes of climbing, the road narrowed to a single track, and the convoy slowed to a crawl. Then they reached a heavy iron gate flanked by rusted no trespassing signs that were riddled with bullet holes. The gate swung open and the convoy pulled into a compound. It was an old defunct lumber mill purchased by the club a decade earlier through a shell corporation and heavily fortified. The main structure was a large timber-framed cabin surrounded by crumbling outbuildings, rusted sawdust silos, and a perimeter fence topped with razor wire. Dozens of bikers were already there, moving weapons, setting up perimeter lights, and unrolling fresh coils of razor wire across the gaps in the fence. Word had spread through the chapter. They were going to war. Nora stepped out of the SUV holding Wyatt against her hip. The sleeping boy stirred but did not wake. The sight of heavily armed, tattooed men illuminated by floodlights did nothing to ease her anxiety. But she stood straight. She did not flinch. She had walked into worse rooms. Inside the main cabin, the space was surprisingly domestic. Leather couches arranged around a wood-burning stove, a large kitchen with a commercial coffee maker and a refrigerator covered in stickers and photographs. The walls were decorated with mounted antlers, old license plates, and a faded American flag. Several women, the wives and girlfriends of club members, were making coffee and laying out sleeping bags on the floor. One of them, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes and a sleeve of floral tattoos that stretched from her wrist to her shoulder, approached Nora with a steaming mug. "You must be the mama. I'm Darlene. You take this. Your boy can sleep in the back room. Nobody's going to bother you." Nora took the mug. Her hands were shaking for the first time all night. Brick led them to a back bedroom with no windows and heavy cinder block walls. "You sleep here. Nobody comes in except me or Hank. There's food in the kitchen. Tomorrow we figure out how to get you new identities and get you out of state." "And what about you?" Nora asked, her voice finding a sliver of courage. "What are you going to do with that card?" "We decrypt it," Brick said flatly. "We find Mercer's weaknesses and we bleed him dry until he calls off the hounds. It's the only way any of us get to live." Nora set Wyatt down on the cot, pulling a rough wool blanket over his small body. She looked at Brick. "I was a nurse," she said, "before all of this, before my husband, before Bodega Bay. If people are going to get hurt tonight, I can help." Brick studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll keep that in mind, Ms. Beckett. Nora." "Nora." He turned to leave. Behind him, Wyatt stirred on the cot, his eyes fluttering open. "Mr. Brick." Brick paused, turning back. "Is Mr. Iron gonna be okay?" The room fell silent. Brick looked at the child who had held his brother's guts together in a dirty ditch. He did not want to lie to the kid. "He's in surgery, Wyatt. It's bad. But he's a stubborn son of a gun. If anyone can fight through it, it's him. And it's because of you that he even has a fighting chance." Wyatt offered a small, satisfied nod. "Okay, good night." Brick walked out into the main compound. His phone vibrated, a text from their contact inside the hospital. Gideon had survived the surgery, but he was in a medically induced coma. He was not out of the woods. In the corner of the cabin, a skinny club member named Goggles was hunched over a heavy-duty Panasonic Toughbook, the micro SD card inserted into a reader. A blinking red prompt demanded a 32-character alphanumeric encryption key. The brute force software estimated completion in 11 hours and 40 minutes. "We don't have 12 hours, Brick growled, racking around into his AR-15. "Mercer will find us before the sun comes up. Tell the boys on the perimeter to stay sharp. Shoot anything that moves in the tree line." 2 miles down the mountain, Dominic Thorne and a team of heavily armed mercenaries were cutting the engines of their matte black tactical vehicles. They pulled night vision goggles down over their eyes, checking their suppressed submachine guns. The siege of the lumber mill was about to begin, and in the center of the crossfire, behind a cinder block wall, a mother held her sleeping son against her chest and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of men preparing for war. Nora Beckett did not sleep that night. She had not expected to. Instead, she lay in the dark with Wyatt curled against her side and counted the sounds. The metallic click of rifle bolts being checked and rechecked. The murmur of voices through the wall, low and tense, the kind of conversation men have when they are discussing the probability of their own deaths. The distant idling of generators providing power to the floodlights. The occasional crunch of boots on gravel as sentries walked the perimeter. She cataloged them the way she used to catalog patient vitals during a night shift in the ICU. Methodical, clinical, because if she let herself feel instead of count, she would break apart, and breaking apart was a luxury she could not afford. At 2 in the morning, she eased Wyatt off her arm without waking him, tucked the wool blanket tighter around his body, and slipped out of the room. The main cabin was dimly lit by a single lamp and the bluish glow of the laptop screen. Goggles sat alone in front of the tough book, his bloodshot eyes locked on the crawling progress bar that inched across the screen with the agonizing slowness of a glacier. Darlene dozed on one of the leather couches, a blanket pulled up to her chin, her reading glasses still perched on the end of her nose. Through the reinforced windows, Nora could see the dark shapes of men standing at the perimeter, their cigarette tips glowing like scattered fireflies in the fog. She found Brick sitting on the front porch of the cabin alone, his shotgun across his knees and a cold cup of coffee beside him on the weathered planking. He did not look up when she sat down on the step beside him. He seemed to know it was her without looking the way a man knows when the air changes in a room. They sat in silence for a long time. The fog was so thick it erased the tree line, creating the illusion that the compound floated in an infinite gray void. Gideon lost his son, Brick said, finally, his voice low and rough, as if the words had to be pulled from somewhere deep. Caleb, 19 years old, overdose. Heroin laced with fentanyl. It came through Mercer's pipeline. He paused. That lighter your boy found, it was Caleb's. Gideon carried it every single day after the funeral, and he used it to hide the one thing that could destroy the people who killed his kid. Nora stared into the fog. She thought about what it would be like to lose Wyatt. The thought was so vast and so dark that her mind refused to hold it for more than a second before recoiling the way a hand recoils from a flame. My husband was not a good man, Nora said quietly. He didn't hit me for the first year. That's how it works. They give you the good year first. By the time the hitting starts, you have already signed the lease and had the baby and quit your job. And then one night you're standing in the kitchen at 3 in the morning holding your son, and you realize that if you don't leave right now, one of you is going to die in this house. Brick looked at her. In the dim porch light, her face was drawn and pale, but her eyes were steady. He had seen that same steadiness in the eyes of men who had been to prison and come back different, harder, clearer, stripped of the illusions that most people carry through their lives like extra weight. You got out, Brick said. I got out, Nora confirmed, and I promised myself that nobody would ever threaten my son again. She looked at the shotgun across his knees. I appreciate what you did tonight, breaking down our door to save us. But I need you to understand something, Mr. Dalton. I am not a damsel. I am not a hostage. I am a mother, and I will do whatever it takes to keep my boy alive. If that means working with a motorcycle club, then that is what I will do. But I am not going to sit in a windowless room and wait for someone else to decide our fate. Brick was quiet for a moment. Then for the first time all night, he smiled. Your son said I was like Batman, Brick murmured. My son has good instincts, Nora replied. But he also thinks Batman is real. I don't have that luxury. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The fog swallowed the sound. Okay, Nora, Brick said, standing up and slinging the shotgun over his shoulder. Here's what I know. Mercer's people are probably already on this mountain. We have maybe 3-4 hours before they find us. The card is encrypted with military-grade software. Our tech guy says 12 hours to crack it. We don't have 12 hours. If we can't open that file before they breach everything your son went through today was for nothing. Nora stood up beside him. She looked out into the impenetrable fog, And for the first time since leaving Bodega Bay, she felt something that was not fear. It was not courage exactly. It was the cold, practical clarity of a woman who had been cornered before and knew that the only way out was through. Then we better make sure we open that file, Nora said. She walked back inside. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. She sat down next to Goggles and asked him to explain what the encryption key looked like and how the brute force program worked. And when the shooting started an hour later, she was still sitting there learning the language of a war she had never asked to join. Fog rolled off the Pacific Ocean and bled into the towering redwoods swallowing the Santa Cruz Mountains in a thick, suffocating gray blanket. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, the hour when the human body's circadian rhythm demands sleep the most, when reflexes slow and eyes play tricks in the dark, and the line between shadow and substance dissolves into uncertainty. For Dominic Thorne and his team of 6 highly trained mercenaries, the fog was a tactical advantage. Dressed in matte black tactical gear, with suppressed Heckler and Koch MP5 submachine guns, they moved through the damp underbrush with the synchronized precision of a wolf pack. Thorne had studied the satellite imagery of the lumber mill compound during the drive up the mountain, memorizing the layout on a tablet strapped to his thigh. He knew the position of the main cabin, the sawdust silos on the eastern flank, the rusted chain link fence at the rear of the property where the bikers had strung crude tripwires between the pines using fishing line and empty beer cans. His men deployed carbon fiber climbing ladders over the fence at the weakest point, bypassing the tripwires entirely. They were inside the perimeter in under 90 seconds. 6 ghosts in the fog moving toward the light of the compound with the calm efficiency of professionals who had done this exact thing in worse places and worse weather on 3 different continents. Cole, the towering prospect who had ridden with Brick earlier that day, was stationed near the old sawdust silos on the eastern flank. He was tired. His massive shoulders slumped under the weight of a heavy leather jacket and an AR-15 slung across his chest. He had been standing in the same position for 4 hours, staring at the same wall of fog, fighting the same battle against his own eyelids. He paused to light a cigarette. The flare of the match illuminated his young, heavily bearded face for a fraction of a second, a brief burst of orange light in the gray darkness. It was a fatal mistake. A suppressed round shattered the silence with a quiet poof, striking the heavy steel silo mere inches from Cole's head. Sparks showered his face hot and bright, stinging his cheeks and forehead. Decades of street survival instincts, honed in Oakland warehouses and San Quentin exercise yards, overrode his exhaustion. Instead of freezing, Cole dropped straight to the muddy ground, screaming at the top of his lungs. "Contact rear perimeter. We got company." Cole did not bother aiming. He blindly pointed his AR-15 into the dense foggy tree line and held the trigger down. The deafening, unsuppressed roar of the 5.56mm rifle echoed off the mountainside like a string of firecrackers inside a tin can, shattering the silence so completely that it seemed impossible silence had ever existed. Instantly, the entire compound erupted into chaos. High-wattage halogen floodlights snapped on, cutting through the fog and illuminating the muddy yard in harsh, overlapping cones of white light. Men who had been dozing against tree trunks and lumber stacks leapt to their feet, grabbing weapons, shouting orders, taking cover behind whatever solid object was closest. Inside the main cabin, Brick was standing over Goggles at the folding table. The micro SD card was still inserted in the tough book, the brute force software still crawling through its infinite permutations. The blinking red prompt demanded a 32-character alphanumeric key. Estimated completion 9 hours and 12 minutes. At the sound of Cole's rifle, Brick kicked the folding chair away. He racked the slide of his customized Colt M1911. The heavy metallic clack was lost under the sudden, thunderous barrage of return fire from outside. "Hank Knuckles, get on the windows!" Brick roared, his voice booming over the chaos. "Nobody breaches this cabin. Goggles, keep that damn program running. If that laptop dies, I'll kill you myself." Brick sprinted to the reinforced cinder block room at the back of the cabin and slammed his fist against the heavy steel door. "Nora, get on the floor and cover the boy. Do not come out until I say the word iron." But Nora was not in the room. She had been sitting next to Goggles in the main cabin when the first shot echoed across the compound. In the fraction of a second between the suppressed crack and the eruption of return fire, Nora had been moving. Not toward the safe room, toward the back hallway where Wyatt slept. She had covered the distance in 4 strides, thrown open the cinder block door, scooped her son off the cot, and pulled him down to the cold concrete floor. Wyatt woke up gasping, his blue eyes wide with disorientation. "Mom, stay low, stay quiet, don't move until I tell you." Nora pressed her son flat against the floor, covering his body with hers. The walls shook with the concussive force of high-caliber weapons firing just outside. The smell of cordite and burning wood began to seep under the doorframe, acrid and chemical. Through the gap at the bottom of the steel door, she could see flashes of light strobing across the cabin floor like a violent, erratic strobe. Wyatt's heart was beating fast like a trapped bird against his ribs, but his mind was strangely clear. He could hear the distinct rhythmic popping of the quiet guns, the suppressed weapons of the mercenaries, contrasting sharply with the booming, chaotic blasts of the bikers' unsuppressed weapons. The two sounds were as different as whispers and shouts, and Wyatt cataloged them automatically, the way he cataloged the differences between types of quartz. Outside, the firefight was intensifying. The Hells Angels had the advantage of fortified positions and raw, overwhelming firepower, but Thorne's mercenaries possessed military discipline and advanced thermal optics that cut through the fog like it was not there. 2 bikers on the northern perimeter went down in the first 60 seconds, hit by rounds they never saw coming from shooters they could not locate. But the Angels fought with a ferocity that no amount of training could match. These were men who had grown up in violence, prison yards, street fights, bar brawls that ended with broken bottles and ambulances. They did not retreat. They did not flinch. They poured fire into the tree line with a reckless abandon that forced even Thorne's disciplined team to take cover behind the thick redwood trunks. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was measured in minutes. Each minute stretched and distorted by adrenaline, by the deafening compression of close-quarters gunfire, by the animal instinct that turns every second into a decision between living and dying. Hank moved from window to window inside the cabin with the methodical patience of a hunter. He had grown up in the Montana backcountry shooting elk at 400 yards with his grandfather's bolt-action rifle, and he applied that same discipline now. 1 shot, 1 pause, 1 assessment, another shot. He did not waste ammunition. He did not fire at shadows. Every round that left his rifle was aimed at a thermal signature or a muzzle flash, and more than once a sharp cry from the tree line confirmed his accuracy. But Thorne's men were adapting. They had spread into a wider arc, flanking the compound from 3 directions, and the halogen lights that had initially given the bikers an advantage now created blind spots at the edges of their coverage. 2 mercenaries had circled to the western side of the compound, finding a gap between the sawdust silos that gave them a clear line of sight to the cabin's side entrance. A burst of suppressed fire punched through the thin wooden wall of the cabin's mudroom, shattering a shelf of canned food and sending glass and preserves spraying across the floor. The rounds walked up the wall in a tight grouping that would have killed anyone standing in the hallway. Then the tear gas came. A canister crashed through the front window of the cabin, bouncing across the hardwood floor and immediately spewing a thick, choking white cloud. The hiss of the gas was almost gentle, a soft exhalation that belied the chemical agony it carried. "Gas mask up or get low!" Hank shouted, firing his shotgun blindly through the shattered window before coughing violently, his eyes streaming. None of them had gas masks. This was a motorcycle club, not a military unit. They had guns, guts, and leather. They did not have tactical countermeasures for chemical agents. Thorne and two of his men used the glass's cover, kicking in the heavy oak front door of the cabin. They moved with lethal efficiency, sweeping the room with laser sights that cut through the white chemical haze like red threads. A brutal close-quarters battle erupted amidst the smoke and ruined furniture. Knuckles took a grazing bullet to the bicep. He roared in pain, dropping the shotgun, and tackled one of the mercenaries through a glass coffee table. The two men crashed to the floor in a shower of glass shards, and Knuckles drove a heavy hunting knife into the mercenary's shoulder, twisting the blade with the savage determination of a man who had survived worse than a gunshot wound. Brick emerged from the hallway, firing 3 precise shots from his 1911. The heavy .45 caliber rounds forced Thorne to dive behind the kitchen island. Granite chips exploded from the countertop as bullets pounded into the stone. The air was unbreathable. The tear gas burned their eyes and lungs, turning every breath into an act of will. "Dalton!" Thorne's voice echoed from behind the granite counter, surprisingly calm despite the gunfire tearing up the cabinetry around him. "This doesn't have to end with you all in body bags. Hand over the drive and the kid and Mercer lets you walk. You have 30 seconds before I call in a mortar strike on this tin roof." Brick spat blood onto the floor, his vision blurring from the tear gas. He knew Thorne was bluffing about the mortar. Mercer would never risk destroying the very data he was trying to retrieve. But the tactical situation was grim. Two of his brothers were down. Knuckles was bleeding heavily. The tear gas was making it impossible to hold position. "Go to hell," Brick yelled back, firing another round that shattered a ceramic bowl inches from Thorne's head. In the corner of the room, crawling on his belly beneath the cloud of noxious gas goggles, was in agony. A stray bullet had grazed his ribs, leaving a hot furrow across his right side that bled freely into the waistband of his jeans. He desperately clutched the tough book, wiping his watering eyes to look at the screen. The brute force program had frozen. An error message flashed in mocking red letters across the screen. "Maximum attempts exceeded. Enter manual override key or data will be purged in 500 minutes." A countdown began. 4 minutes and 59 seconds. 4 minutes and 58. Goggles felt a cold knot of utter despair form in his stomach. The drive was going to wipe itself. They had gone to war, bled, and were about to die for a piece of plastic that was about to become completely useless. "Brick!" Goggles screamed, his voice cracking. "The program crashed. It's going to wipe 5 minutes." Brick heard the shout through the chaos. For the first time that night, something that resembled fear crossed the sergeant at arm's face. Not fear of dying, fear of losing. Fear that everything Gideon had sacrificed, everything this kid had risked, was about to evaporate in a digital self-destruct. Behind the steel door of the safe room, Nora heard every word. The acoustics of the cinder block chamber amplified the sounds from the cabin like a concrete echo chamber. She heard Goggles scream about the wipe. She heard the desperation in Brick's voice. And she understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had spent years reading situations for survival, that the thing her son had almost died to protect was about to destroy itself. Then Wyatt moved. The boy pulled away from his mother's grasp, rising to his knees on the cold concrete floor. "Wyatt, no, stay down," Nora hissed, grabbing the strap of his pajama top. "I have to tell them, Mom." Wyatt whispered, his blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stopped her breath. "Tell them what?" The lighter had writing on it. "Mr. Iron's lighter. When I buried it in my rocks, I looked at the bottom. It had scratches on it, like someone used a knife." Nora stared at her son. In the strobing chaos of gunfire and chemical fog, her 7-year-old boy had just told her he might hold the key to everything. The password, carved into the bottom of a dead man's lighter by a grieving father who trusted analog over digital. She looked at the steel door. Beyond it lay a war zone. Automatic weapons, tear gas, professional killers. Every cell in her body screamed at her to keep her son on this floor behind this wall. But Nora Beckett had spent 3 years learning the difference between a risk that destroys you and a risk that saves you. And she knew with a certainty that settled in her bones like cold water that if that data wiped, the people hunting them would never stop. The leverage would be gone, the protection would vanish, and she and Wyatt would spend the rest of their lives running from men who did not forgive. "Tell me the word," Nora said. "I'll go." "I have to show them. I can't explain it. I saw the shapes." Wyatt's voice was urgent. "Please, Mom, I have to tell Batman." Nora closed her eyes for 1 second, one full second in which she calculated every risk, weighed every outcome, and then made the decision that would define the rest of her life. "Okay, we go together. You stay low, you stay behind me, and when we get to the computer, you say the word, and then we come straight back to this room. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Nora reached up and turned the heavy deadbolt. She pulled the steel door open, just a crack, and the full force of the battle crashed into the small room like a wave breaking over a seawall. The main cabin was a hellscape. The tear gas hung in the air like toxic fog, making it nearly impossible to see. Bullet holes had turned the drywall into Swiss cheese. The deafening staccato of automatic gunfire from outside continued to rattle the floorboards. Spent brass casings rolled across the hardwood like scattered pennies. Nora dropped to her hands and knees. Wyatt dropped behind her. Together they crawled out of the safe room and into the hallway. Nora went first, her body forming a shield between her son and the direction of fire. The floor was covered in shattered glass debris and slippery patches of blood. A shard of glass sliced through the knee of her jeans, and she felt the hot sting of a cut, but she did not stop. Another shard caught her right palm, and she felt it embed itself in the heel of her hand, but she kept crawling. They moved beneath the worst of the beast layered, staying below the toxic cloud that hovered at chest height. Nora's lungs burned, her eyes streamed. She could feel Wyatt coughing behind her, his small hand gripping the hem of her sweater with a grip that would not release. She kept moving. 10 feet to the end of the hallway, then a left turn past the overturned couch, where Knuckles was slumped, clutching his bleeding arm, still firing one-handed toward the shattered front window. The laptop. She could see its dim bluish glow on the floor near the far wall, where Goggles had dragged it during the firefight. The skinny biker was curled around the tough book like a man protecting a baby, his face a mask of pain and chemical tears. The countdown on the screen read 2:47. Nora reached Goggles first. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and he flinched so violently he nearly knocked the laptop off the floor. "The boy has the password," Nora said, her voice somehow steady through the choking gas. Goggles opened one bloodshot eye. When he saw the woman and the 7-year-old kid crawling through a literal gunfight, he thought the tear gas was making him hallucinate. "Are you insane? Get him out of here." "The password," Nora repeated, pulling Wyatt forward, and positioning her body between him and the direction of the nearest gunfire. He saw it on the lighter. "Tell him, Wyatt." Wyatt pressed himself flat against the floor next to the laptop, squinting at the screen through burning eyes. The countdown read 2:19. "It's asking for a secret word, right? It's encrypted, kid." Goggles wheezed, groaning as he shifted his weight. "We're locked out. It's going to wipe the data in 2 minutes." "I know the word," Wyatt said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos. "When I buried the silver lighter in my rocks, I looked at the bottom. It had scratches on it, not like normal writing, like someone used a knife." Goggles grabbed the tough book, pulling it closer to his face. The countdown read 1:51. "What did it say? Tell me exactly." Wyatt closed his eyes. The world around him was fire and smoke and the deafening hammer of gunshots, but behind his eyelids, he was back in his quiet bedroom, holding the heavy silver rectangle in his small hands, turning it over in the thin moonlight, tracing the deep, jagged grooves carved into the polished metal with his fingertip. He saw the shapes clearly: the tall letter at the beginning, the smaller letters that followed, the horizontal line, the numbers, the mark at the end. It said Panhead. Wyatt recited carefully, opening his eyes. "With a big P, then a dash, then the numbers 1948, and then an exclamation point." Goggles' fingers flew across the keyboard, his bloody knuckles smearing the keys. "PNHEAD dash 1948 exclamation. Panhead, 1948. The year Harley-Davidson introduced the iconic Panhead engine, the year Gideon's father was born. It was exactly the kind of old-school analog password a hardened biker would use for high-tech encryption, a word that meant nothing to the digital world, but everything to the Brotherhood. The countdown read 1:04. Goggles hit the enter key. The red warning screen vanished. For a terrifying 2 seconds, the screen went completely black. Nora felt her heart stop. She was crouched over her son, shielding his body with hers, glass cutting into her palms, lungs burning from the gout, and for 2 seconds, the only thought in her mind was, "We did all of this for nothing." Then a massive green progress bar shot across the screen, followed by a cascade of files, spreadsheets, and high-resolution photographs. Folders opened like digital blossoms, each one containing meticulously organized evidence: bank statements with routing numbers, surveillance photos of judges accepting envelopes, shipping manifests with dates, weights, and dock numbers at the Port of Oakland, phone records, email chains, video files. Holy Mother of God! Goggles breathed, his jaw dropping. The pain in his ribs was forgotten. The tear gas was forgotten. He was staring at the complete anatomy of a criminal empire laid bare on a battered laptop in the middle of a firefight. "Brick!" Goggles screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with something that sounded like joy. "Brick, we're in. I got the ledger. I got everything." Behind the kitchen island, Brick heard the shout. A feral, blood-stained grin spread across his face. He looked in the direction of Thorne, who was currently reloading his MP5 behind the overturned refrigerator. "Hey, Thorne!" Brick roared over the gunfire. "Tell your boys to cease fire right now." "Why would I do that, Dalton?" Thorne shouted back, snapping his fresh magazine into place. "You're trapped. Because my tech guy just unlocked Mercer's black book." Brick countered, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. "And right now he's looking at an offshore account in the Cayman Islands containing $42 million. Account number 8840-2BC. Brick paused, letting the silence fill the gaps between gunshots. "Sound familiar?" There was a dead, heavy silence from behind the overturned refrigerator. The gunfire outside began to slow as the mercenaries noticed their commander had stopped giving orders. Nora crouched over the laptop, scanning the open files with rapid, practiced eyes. Her nursing training had not prepared her for criminal forensics, but she could read a spreadsheet, and the numbers she was seeing were staggering. She clicked open a folder labeled Personnel. Inside was a list of names organized by agency: Sonoma County Sheriff's Department, Oakland PD, the District Attorney's Office, 2 state legislators. Next to each name was a payment history going back 7 years. "There are judges on here," Nora whispered to Goggles, scrolling through the list. "Federal judges. If I die or if anything happens to this kid or his mother," Brick dictated, projecting his voice so every mercenary in the room could hear him, "a dead man's switch activates on that laptop. The entire unredacted ledger gets emailed to the FBI field office in San Francisco, the DEA, and every major news outlet on the West Coast. Mercer goes down, the corrupt cops go down, and you, Thorne, become the most wanted man in the hemisphere." Thorne slowly stood up from behind the refrigerator. His weapon was lowered. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were doing calculations. He reached up and pressed the communication earpiece deep into his ear. "Mr. Mercer, do you copy?" Miles away in his penthouse, Vincent Mercer listened to the audio feed from Thorne's rig. His face was pale. His hands trembled slightly as he set his crystal Scotch glass down on his mahogany desk. The bikers had him by the throat. A 7-year-old boy had unlocked his entire empire, and a mother crawling through tear gas had helped deliver the killing blow. "Stand down, Dominic," Mercer ordered, his voice cold and devoid of its usual arrogant flair. "Withdraw the men immediately." "Understood," Thorne replied. He looked at Brick, who had stepped fully into the center of the ruined cabin. Behind Brick, Nora stood up from her crouch over the laptop, Wyatt pulled tight against her hip. Her eyes were red and swollen from the tear gas. Blood seeped from a dozen small cuts on her hands and knees. A long gash on her right shoulder, where a shard of glass had sliced through her sweater during the crawl, bled freely down her arm. But she stood straight. Thorne looked at the woman, then at the child, then back at Brick. "You bought yourself a stay of execution, Dalton, but Mercer doesn't forgive." "Neither do we," Brick growled. "Tell your boss we own him now. If a single cop looks at this kid funny, if a single health inspector visits his mother's diner, if a single letter from a lawyer arrives at their door, I am burning Mercer's empire to the ground." Thorne did not reply. He signaled to his surviving men, and like ghosts they faded back into the thick, choking fog, taking their wounded with them. Within 3 minutes, the only sounds left in the compound were the hiss of the dying tear gas canister and the groans of wounded bikers scattered across the muddy yard. Brick lowered his gun. His massive chest heaved as he gasped for clean air. He turned to look down the hallway. Nora stood there, one arm wrapped around Wyatt, the other hanging at her side, blood dripping from her fingertips onto the debris-covered floor. Wyatt looked up at Brick from beneath his mother's arm. The 7-year-old was covered in soot, gasping from the smoke, his pajamas torn and dirty. But he looked up at the massive biker with the same calm, determined expression he had worn in the ditch on Highway 1. Brick walked over, his heavy boots crunching on the debris. He knelt in front of the boy, ignoring the searing pain in his bad knee. He reached out and gently rested his massive tattooed hand on Wyatt's small shoulder. "You did it, kid," Brick whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved Gideon, and you just saved all of us." Then Brick looked up at Nora, at the blood on her hands, the glass in her knees, the gash on her shoulder. "Both of you did." The cabin fell into a stunned, ringing silence. The kind of silence that follows a car crash, where the world seems to hold its breath before the screaming starts. Then slowly the compound began to stir. Voices called out names, roll call, the ancient essential ritual of counting the living after the dying was done. Darlene emerged from the root cellar beneath the cabin and immediately took charge of the wounded. Hank appeared with a first aid kit that looked like it had been assembled from a veterinary supply catalog. Goggles was still on the floor, curled around the laptop, his eyes fixed on the screen. Nora looked at Knuckles, who was sitting against the wall, pressing a blood-soaked rag against his bicep with his teeth clenched. "Let me see." Knuckles looked at her with bloodshot eyes. The calm authority in this woman's voice made him comply without question. Nora examined the wound. The bullet had carved a deep furrow through the outer muscle of his bicep, but had not hit the brachial artery or shattered the humerus. "It's a graze, deep but clean. I need a needle-heavy thread and a bottle of something strong." Darlene appeared at her side with a sewing kit, a bottle of cheap bourbon, and a roll of duct tape. "This is what we got. This will work." She poured bourbon over the wound. Knuckles hissed through his teeth but did not pull away. Nora threaded the needle with the steady hands of a woman who had spent years placing IV lines in the dim light of overcrowded hospital wards. She closed the wound in 12 neat stitches, packed it with clean gauze, and secured the bandage with strips of duct tape. She moved to the next wounded man, a grizzled veteran named Red who had taken a bullet fragment in his left thigh. She extracted it with sterilized needle-nose pliers while Red bit down on a leather belt. She treated 5 injured bikers over the next 2 hours with the clinical precision of a registered nurse who had never let her certification lapse in her heart. The men watched her work with a mixture of awe and confusion. This was the mother who had been carried into their compound as a civilian liability, and here she was on her knees in the wreckage putting them back together. Brick watched from the doorway. He had rarely seen the kind of strength Nora Beckett displayed that night. It was not the strength of violence. It was the strength of competence. The quiet, devastating power of a person who knows exactly what they are doing and does it without hesitation, without complaint, and without asking for permission. When the last wound was dressed, Nora walked back to the cinder block room where Wyatt had fallen asleep on the cot. She sat down on the floor beside him. Her hands were shaking now. Brick appeared in the doorway with a clean towel and a mug of hot coffee. Goggles backed up the entire drive to 3 encrypted cloud servers. Brick said quietly, "Even if they destroy the laptop, the data's safe. The dead man's switch is real." Nora took the coffee. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "How long before it's safe?" "I don't know. Maybe never. But right now we have leverage. Mercer can't touch us without destroying himself." "A stalemate isn't safe," Nora said. "A stalemate is just 2 people pointing guns at each other until one of them blinks. Then we make sure we don't blink." Nora looked at her sleeping son. "Brick, I need you to promise me something. Name it. If something happens to me, you get him out. Not into your world, out. You find him a family, a normal family, with a house and a yard and a school that doesn't have metal detectors. You make sure he has a life that looks nothing like tonight." Brick was silent for a long time. He thought about his own childhood, a father who drank and a mother who left. He had found the club at 17. For 27 years, the club had been everything. But he had also buried too many friends. He had attended too many funerals in too many small churches where the pews were filled with men in leather and the coffins were closed. He looked at the sleeping boy. "Nothing's going to happen to you," Brick said. "Promise me." "I promise." Nora nodded. She lay down on the concrete floor beside the cot and placed one hand on Wyatt's back. She could feel his heartbeat through the thin fabric of his pajamas. Steady, low, alive. She closed her eyes. Outside, the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the redwoods. Brick stood on the porch of the ruined cabin, watching the sun come up. His phone vibrated. A text from the hospital. Gideon had survived the night, still in a coma, still critical, but alive. The war was not over. Mercer was wounded, not dead. Holloway was still out there. But in this moment, the sun was rising. A mother and her son were sleeping behind a steel door. A laptop full of secrets was backed up across 3 continents. And a motorcycle club that had been fighting for territory and profit had found something they had not expected to fight for. A 7-year-old boy and the woman who raised him. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the Sonoma Memorial Hospital, distorting the city lights into angry smeared streaks of neon. 2 weeks had passed since the brutal firefight at the lumber mill. 2 weeks of tense, heavily armed silence. The digital standoff orchestrated by Brick Dalton had forced Vincent Mercer to withdraw his forces, freezing the underworld in a Cold War that neither side could afford to escalate. Nora Beckett and Wyatt had been relocated to a heavily fortified apartment in downtown Santa Rosa. 2 patch members stood guard outside their door around the clock. The apartment was spacious, clean. It had a view of the courthouse square and a kitchen with appliances that actually worked, which was more than Nora could say for the ranch house in Bodega Bay. She should have felt safe. She did not. Safety for Nora was not a location. It was not a locked door or an armed guard. It was the absence of dependency. And right now, she was entirely dependent on a motorcycle club for every element of her survival. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent 3 years building independence from one dangerous man, only to find herself sheltered by an entire organization of dangerous men. But there was a difference, and Nora forced herself to recognize it. Derek had isolated her. These men had included her. Derek had diminished her competence. Brick had leveraged it. The night she had stitched up Knuckles and treated the wounded bikers in the wreckage of the lumber mill had changed something in the way the club saw her. She was no longer the civilian. She was Wyatt's mother, and in their world, that title now carried weight. Wyatt, for his part, seemed oddly well-adjusted. He did his homework at the kitchen table. He arranged his rock collection on the windowsill. He asked every single day if Mr. Iron was awake yet. On the 14th day, Nora's phone rang. It was Brick. "He's awake." 2 words, but they changed everything. Nora stood in the doorway of room 412, Wyatt's hand in hers, and looked at the man her son had saved. Gideon Blackwell was a ruin. He was propped up in the hospital bed, his massive frame diminished by 2 weeks of muscle atrophy. His face was gaunt, his skin the color of old paper. Tubes ran from his arms to beeping machines. His eyes were open. They were bloodshot and sunken, but they were open and they were focused. And when they landed on the small blonde boy standing in the doorway, something cracked behind them. Wyatt released his mother's hand and walked into the room with the same unhurried pace he had used to approach a dying man in a ditch on Highway 1. "Hi, Mr. Iron, you stopped leaking." Gideon stared at the boy. His cracked lips parted. No sound came out for a long moment. Then, in a voice ravaged by intubation and disuse, he said, "You're the kid." "I'm Wyatt. I know who you are." Gideon's eyes glistened. He reached out with a hand that shook badly. "They told me what you did. All of it. The phone call, the lighter, the password." "You said Broken spoke," Wyatt replied matter-of-factly, "and I called Batman." A sound came from Gideon's chest. It might have been a laugh. It might have been a sob. It immediately turned into a cough that made the monitors spike. When the cough subsided, Gideon looked past Wyatt to the woman standing near the door. He studied her with the careful attention of a man who had spent his life assessing threats and allies. "You're his mother," Gideon said. Nora stepped forward. "I am. Brick told me what you did at the mill. The crawling, the medical work. He said you held a knife on Holloway before he even got there. I did what I had to do." Gideon nodded slowly. He looked at Wyatt again. The boy was examining the medical monitors with the same focused curiosity he applied to his rock collection, tracing the waveforms of the heart monitor with his finger. "He reminds me of someone," Gideon said quietly, almost to himself. "Who?" Wyatt asked, because 7-year-olds hear everything. Gideon was silent for a long time. The monitors beeped. Rain streaked the window. "My son," Gideon said. "Caleb, he was brave like you, curious like you. He used to collect things too, not rocks, bottle caps. Had a whole drawer full of them." He paused. "He died last year." Wyatt looked at Gideon with an expression that no child should have to wear, but that some children learn early. "I'm sorry about your son, Mr. Iron." Gideon closed his eyes. A single tear tracked down the side of his gaunt face. Nora watched from the foot of the bed, her own eyes burning. She thought about every night she had lain awake listening to Wyatt breathe, terrified that the world would take him from her. "Thank you," Gideon whispered, opening his eyes and looking at Nora, "for raising him, for being the kind of mother who teaches her kid to stop and help instead of running away." "I didn't teach him that," Nora said honestly. "He came that way. I just tried not to break it." They stayed for an hour. Wyatt told Gideon about his rock collection in the new apartment and how Darlene had taught him to make grilled cheese with 3 different kinds of cheese. He told him about the creek where he found green glass worn smooth by the water and his sneakers that lit up when he stomped. Gideon listened with the focused attention of a man hearing music for the first time after a long silence. He asked questions. Which cheese was best? What color were the sneakers? Did the creek have crawdads? And Wyatt answered every question with the earnest thoroughness of a child who had finally found an adult who wanted to hear the details. Nora sat in the corner chair and watched. She watched the tightness around Gideon's eyes soften, his breathing even out. She recognized what was happening, the healing power of ordinary conversation. Gideon Blackwell had been operated on by some of the best trauma surgeons in Northern California. But the thing putting color back in his face was a 7-year-old boy talking about grilled cheese. When Wyatt finally nodded it off in the hospital chair, Nora picked him up and settled him against her hip. "We'll come back tomorrow," she told Gideon. "I'd like that." Nora paused at the door. "The lighter, it was your son's." Gideon nodded. "Brick told me, Caleb's lighter, and you hid the evidence inside it. The thing that could destroy the people who killed him. I wanted it to mean something." Gideon said, his voice raw. "His death. I wanted it to mean something." Nora held his gaze. "It does." She walked out carrying her sleeping son and did not look back. That night, Nora sat at the kitchen table scrolling through the backed-up files on a secure tablet Goggles had configured for her. Brick had given her access, recognizing that a woman with medical training and a sharp analytical mind was more useful informed than ignorant. She had been studying the ledger in her spare time, organizing the data, cross-referencing names and dates, looking for patterns the way she used to read patient charts for anomalies. It was during one of these late-night sessions that she found it. Buried in a subfolder labeled Medical Assets was a list of healthcare professionals on Mercer's payroll, and one name that made her blood run cold. Dr. Raymond Garrett, Chief of Internal Medicine. Sonoma Memorial Hospital, the hospital where Gideon was recovering. Nora's nursing training kicked in before her fear could. She pulled up Garrett's payment history. Monthly deposits of $15,000 into a shell account going back 4 years. Garrett was not just a name on a list. He was an active asset, a man who could walk into any room in the hospital without question, a man who had access to patient records, medication dispensaries, and IV lines. She called Brick at 2 in the morning. "There's a doctor at Sonoma Memorial on Mercer's payroll, Raymond Garrett, chief of internal medicine. He has access to Gideon's floor." The line was silent for 3 seconds. "I'm doubling the guard," Brick said, "right now." But there was a fatal loose end that neither the club's security nor Nora's analysis could fully predict. Marcus Holloway, stripped of his badge and abandoned by the Mercer Syndicate, was a man completely out of options. The cartel had frozen his offshore accounts. Internal Affairs was tearing through his case files. He was a ghost in his own city. He was living in a pay-by-the-week motel on the outskirts of Rohnert Park. The room smelled of mildew and cheap disinfectant. His ex-wife had changed the locks. His daughter had stopped answering his calls. His pension was frozen. Holloway's paranoia had morphed into toxic, blinding rage. He sat in the dim motel room surrounded by takeout containers and empty coffee cups and mapped his destruction on the wall. At the center of everything was a photograph of a 7-year-old boy in overalls covered in blood. He blamed the bikers. He blamed Mercer for cutting him loose. But most of all, he blamed the child. If Holloway was going down, he was going to take the club's beloved enforcer with him. One final wound that could not be stitched closed. His plan was clinical. Target Gideon Blackwell. Location ICU, room 412. Objective lethal injection via untraceable potassium chloride mimicking a massive cardiac arrest. No fingerprints, no ballistics, just a dead biker and a death certificate. At 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, wearing stolen blue scrubs and a surgical mask, Holloway bypassed the hospital's rear security. Through a maintenance entrance he had used dozens of times, he moved with the desperate, silent efficiency of a cornered predator. In his right hand, hidden inside the pocket of the scrubs, was a syringe filled with clear liquid. Down the hall, room 412 was bathed in the sterile blue glow of medical monitors. Gideon was awake, propped up in bed, reading a worn paperback Western. He was improving daily, but he was also uneasy. His instincts were telling him the air felt wrong tonight. The hallway was too quiet. The usual prospect posted outside his door was absent. The hallway was quiet because Brick had cleared it. On Nora's warning about Dr. Garrett, Brick had pulled the prospect from the door and repositioned him at the end of the corridor. Anyone approaching room 412 would have to walk through an empty hallway with no witnesses. It was not a security gap. It was an invitation. Holloway crept to the doorway. He pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped into the dimly lit room. He approached the bed, his hand closing around the syringe. 2 steps from the IV stand, 1 step. "You always were a sloppy cop, Bobby." Holloway froze. The voice came from the dark corner of the room. A large silhouette detached itself from the shadows. Brick Dalton stepped into the dim light holding a suppressed 9mm pistol, pointed directly at the bridge of Holloway's nose. Holloway spun around, reaching for the snub-nosed revolver tucked into his waistband. But before his fingers could brush the grip, the bathroom door swung open. Hank stepped out, a heavy taser humming dangerously in his right hand. "Drop the needle, Marcus," Brick commanded. "Drop it, or they'll be mopping you off the linoleum." The syringe clattered to the floor, rolling under the hospital bed. Holloway raised his hands. "You can't kill me here, Dalton. The hospital is crawling with cameras." "Who said anything about killing you?" A weak, raspy voice croaked from the bed. Holloway looked down. Gideon's eyes were open. burning with undeniable triumph. "We don't need to kill you," Brick explained, relieving Holloway of his revolver. "When Wyatt unlocked that ledger, we didn't just find Mercer's bank accounts. We found the names of every dirty badge in your precinct. But more importantly, we found the names of the clean ones." Holloway's face went entirely pale. "We packaged up your specific payroll files, your communications with Mercer, and the security footage of you kicking in a civilian woman's door," Brick continued. "We handed it directly to a state trooper captain who has been trying to nail you for 5 years. Captain James Waverly. We knew you'd make a play for Gideon," Hank said from behind him. "A rat always tries to bite when it's cornered, so we cleared the hall and we invited the troopers to the show." The heavy double doors of the ICU wing burst open. 4 heavily armed state police officers flooded into the room, their weapons trained on the disgraced detective. Holloway did not fight. The fight drained out of him completely. They slammed him against the wall with an efficiency that suggested they had been wanting to do this for a long time. The cold steel of handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. Gideon spoke from the bed. His voice was weak, but every word carried weight. "You sold your soul to Mercer, Bobby. You took his money and you looked the other way while his poison killed kids in their bedrooms and their parents' bathrooms. My son, other people's sons, other people's daughters. And you did it for what? A house in Petaluma, a boat you never use." Holloway said nothing. A trooper gripped his elbow. "A 7-year-old boy had more honor in his little finger than you had in your entire career," Gideon said, "and so did his mother." As they pulled Holloway toward the door, he found himself face to face with someone he did not expect. Nora Beckett stood in the hallway, arms folded across her chest. She had insisted on being here, and Brick had not argued. Holloway looked at her, the woman whose door he had pounded on, the mother whose son he had grabbed by the collar. Nora looked back at him. She did not flinch. She did not gloat. "You underestimated the wrong people," Nora said quietly. The troopers marched him down the hallway, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, the sound growing fainter until the ICU doors swung shut. Brick holstered his weapon and walked to Gideon's bed. "It's over, brother. The leak is plugged. Mercer is boxed in. We're safe." Gideon coughed, but he managed a weak nod. "The kid, safe, sleeping like a rock across town. He's asking about you every day." "And his mother." Brick glanced at the hallway where Nora had been standing. She had already slipped away, walking toward the elevator, checking on Wyatt. "She's something else," Brick said. Gideon closed his eyes. A faint, genuine smile touched the corners of his scarred mouth. He had faced the Reaper in a dusty ditch on Highway 1, expecting to die alone in the dirt. Instead, he had been saved by a child with a peanut butter sandwich and protected by a mother with steady hands and a spine made of cold steel. The rain continued to fall. The monitors beeped. And for the first time in 14 months, Gideon Blackwell fell asleep without dreaming of his dead son. He dreamed instead of a boy in overalls kneeling in the dirt, pressing his small hands against a wound and refusing to let go. 6 months passed. The dust settled on Sonoma County, leaving a permanently altered landscape in its wake. Vincent Mercer's criminal empire did not collapse overnight. It suffocated slowly like a fire starved of oxygen. The anonymous thread of the decrypted ledger kept his organization paralyzed. His lieutenants deserted. 2 of his most trusted captains were arrested on charges that bore the fingerprints of leaked ledger data. His suppliers found other clients. His lawyers stopped returning his calls. His accountants fled to countries without extradition treaties. The empire that had taken 20 years to build was being dismantled by its own fear. The Hells Angels did not release the ledger. They did not need to. The threat was the weapon, and weapons Brick understood were most powerful when they were never fired. Marcus Holloway traded his detective shield for a federal prison uniform. The trial lasted 3 weeks and dominated every newspaper in Northern California. Captain Waverly's case was airtight. The prosecution presented financial records, encrypted communications, and testimony from 3 fellow officers turned by the evidence. Holloway was convicted on 17 counts, including corruption, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Sentenced to 32 years without parole. Nora watched from the gallery, Wyatt's hand in hers. She had testified in a clear, steady voice that did not waver even when the defense attorney tried to discredit her. She told the truth, all of it. The knock on the door, the lie about narcotics, the hand on her son's collar, the knife she had taken from the block. When she stepped down from the witness stand, Brick was waiting in the hallway. He did not say anything. He just nodded, and Nora nodded back. And that was enough. Nora Beckett enrolled in a nursing recertification program at Santa Rosa Junior College. She attended classes 3 days a week and studied at the kitchen table while Wyatt did his homework beside her. The textbooks were familiar. The procedures had not changed as much as she feared. What had changed was her. She was no longer the woman who had quit nursing because a man told her to. She was the woman who had sutured a bullet wound with a sewing kit in a burning cabin while her son decoded an encryption key 10 feet away. Clinical rotations felt manageable after that. She had her license back within 4 months. She took a position at a family clinic in Sebastopol, working regular hours for the first time in years. She signed a lease on a small house with a garden and a front porch with 2 rocking chairs. The house was nothing special. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen, with a window that looked out onto a row of apple trees that bloomed white in the spring. But it was hers. Her name was on the lease. Her money paid the rent. And the front door had a deadbolt that she checked every night, not out of fear, but out of habit. Some habits you keep because they remind you of how far you have come. She never fully left the club's orbit. She could not. The bond forged in blood and tear gas was not the kind that dissolved with distance. Darlene called every Sunday. Knuckles, whose arm healed with a scar he showed off with pride, brought Wyatt a model motorcycle for his 8th birthday. And Brick checked in weekly, always the same question. Everything okay? Everything was okay. On a Sunday afternoon in late January, a thunderous roar broke the quiet of the neighborhood. 14 gleaming Harley-Davidson motorcycles rolled down the residential street and into the freshly paved driveway of the Beckett house. Neighbors paused in their yards, garden hoses in hand, staring at the procession of chrome and leather. Gideon Blackwell dismounted last. He walked with a heavy cane, his left leg still refusing to bend properly, where the femur had been shattered and rebuilt with titanium rods. His leather cut hung looser on his diminished frame. But he was upright. He was moving under his own power, and his eyes were clear. Wyatt was sitting on the front porch steps, his plastic bucket of rocks resting beside him. He had outgrown the overalls. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt and scuffed sneakers. When he saw the motorcycles, his face split into a grin so wide it seemed to contain every good thing he had ever felt. He did not run down the steps. He waited, watching with that same patient, focused attention as Gideon made his slow, painful way up the front walk. Gideon stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at the boy who had found him bleeding in a ditch, the boy who had pressed his small hands against a wound and called a stranger on a dead man's phone, the boy who had crawled through a gunfight to read a password carved into a dead man's lighter. Gideon reached inside his leather cut. From the inner pocket, he withdrew the heavy silver Zippo lighter. He had asked Brick to retrieve it after the trial. He had spent an afternoon in his garage with a small engraving tool, hands still unsteady from nerve damage, carefully adding new markings to the bottom of the case. He held the lighter out to Wyatt. Wyatt took it. He turned it over in his hands the way he always did. And on the bottom, beside the deep scratches that read Caleb in fresher, slightly less steady grooves, was a new name, Wyatt. The boy looked up at the biker. Gideon looked down at the boy. No words were spoken, because there were no words for what passed between them. It was not gratitude. It was not obligation. It was something older and deeper. The recognition that a stranger's child had given a broken man a reason to keep breathing, that a dying father's last act of love had been handed to a living boy who treated it with the seriousness it deserved, that the names of two boys, one dead and one alive, now shared the same piece of silver, and that was as close to prayer as a man like Gideon would ever get. Nora stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, a cup of coffee in her hand. She watched her son hold the lighter. She watched the massive biker stand before him with tears running silently into his beard. She watched the 14 motorcycles idling in her driveway, their engines rumbling like the heartbeat of some enormous, loyal animal. She had spent years running, from Derek, from debt, from the persistent, exhausting fear that the world was designed to break women like her and children like Wyatt. And now she was standing on the porch of a house she had rented with money she had earned, watching her son be honored by men who would kill and die for him, and she felt something she had almost forgotten existed. She felt home. Gideon straightened up. He looked at Nora. "You raised an extraordinary boy," Gideon said. "I raised a boy who knows right from wrong," Nora replied. "I just taught him the only thing I knew for sure. When someone needs help, you don't turn around." Gideon nodded. He looked at the porch, at the two rocking chairs, at the garden Nora had planted along the walkway. "Would you mind if I sat down for a while? The leg doesn't like standing for long." Nora looked at the second rocking chair, the one that had been empty since she moved in. She had bought two because the house came that way, and she had never found a reason to remove it. "Take a seat. I'll get you a coffee." Gideon lowered himself into the chair with a grunt. Brick took the porch railing. The other bikers cut their engines and dismounted, spreading across the small yard like a leather-clad family reunion. Hank threw a football with one of the younger members. Knuckles sat on the lawn and let Wyatt show him the rock collection, nodding seriously as the boy explained the difference between quartz and feldspar. Nora came back with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Gideon and sat down in the other rocking chair. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, two damaged people in 2 rocking chairs, watching a 7-year-old boy explain geology to a scarred biker on a suburban lawn, while 14 Harleys cooled in the driveway. Gideon sipped his coffee. He stared at the garden, at the green shoots pushing up through the January soil. "You know," he said quietly, "Caleb used to garden when he was small, before everything went sideways. He had a little plot in the backyard, grew tomatoes. They were terrible, small and hard and sour, but he was so damn proud of them." Nora listened. She did not say she was sorry. She did not offer platitudes. She just listened the way she had learned to listen in nursing school and in her marriage and in all the quiet, difficult moments in between. The kind of listening that does not try to fix anything. The kind that just makes room. "I spent 14 months thinking the only thing I could do for him was destroy the people who killed him." Gideon continued, his voice barely audible. "Burn it all down, make them pay. And I did. We did. But standing here now looking at your boy with that lighter in his pocket, I think maybe that's not the thing Caleb would have wanted. What do you think he would have wanted? Gideon was quiet for a long time. The winter sun was low, casting long golden shadows across the yard. Wyatt had moved on from rocks and was now trying to teach Knuckles how to identify different kinds of beetles, which Knuckles was tolerating with the patient confusion of a man who had once bitten through a pair of handcuffs. I think he would have wanted me to sit on a porch, Gideon said, drink a cup of coffee, watch a kid play in a yard, and stop carrying his lighter like a weapon. Nora rocked slowly in her chair. She thought about the night she had packed one suitcase, the morning she had arrived in Bodega Bay, the afternoon Wyatt had found a dying man in a ditch, the midnight crawl through tear gas, the two names on a silver lighter, and this moment, this quiet, ordinary, extraordinary moment on a porch in a suburb drinking coffee with a man who had come back from the dead. You can come back next Sunday, Nora said, if you want. I'd like that. The afternoon wore on. The sun dipped below the redwoods. The bikers began to mount up engines, coughing to life one by one, the rumble building into the familiar thunder that had once meant violence and now meant something closer to family. Gideon stood using the cane and the porch railing and made his way slowly down the steps. At the bottom, Wyatt was waiting. The boy held up the silver lighter. Mr. Iron, do you want this back? Gideon looked at the lighter, at the two names on the bottom. He knelt painfully, his bad knee protesting, and wrapped his massive hand around Wyatt's small fist, closing the boy's fingers over the silver case. It was always yours, kid, from the moment I put it in your pocket. Wyatt nodded. He slipped the lighter into the front pocket of his jeans. It rested against his thigh, heavy and warm, the way it had on that first afternoon in the ditch when the world split open and a 7-year-old boy chose to stay. Gideon rose. He walked to his motorcycle. He mounted it slowly, painfully, but with the practiced ease of a man who had been riding since before the boy's mother was born. He looked back at the porch one last time. Nora raised her coffee mug, a small gesture, a civilian salute. Gideon nodded, then he kicked the engine to life, and the Harley roared and the convoy pulled out of the driveway, 14 motorcycles rolling down the suburban street in a loose formation that scattered golden light across the asphalt. Nora watched them go. She watched until the last motorcycle turned the corner and the thunder faded into the hum of the evening, replaced by the sound of sprinklers and distant television sets and a dog barking 3 houses down. Wyatt climbed the porch steps and sat down in the rocking chair Gideon had used. It was too big for him. His feet dangled a foot above the porch boards. Mom, yeah, buddy. Are we safe now? Nora looked at her son, at his blue eyes, at the lighter-shaped bulge in his front pocket, at the dirt under his fingernails from the rock collection and the creek and the garden she was teaching him to tend. Yeah, Nora said, we're safe now. Wyatt nodded. He rocked the chair gently, his small hands gripping the armrests, staring out at the yard where the January sun was painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Nora sipped her coffee. She rocked in her chair, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not check the locks. The weeks that followed settled into something Nora had not felt in years. A rhythm. Not the frantic, breath-holding rhythm of survival, but the slow, steady rhythm of a life being built one ordinary day at a time. She got up at 6, made Wyatt breakfast, drove him to the elementary school 3 blocks from the clinic where she worked, saw patients until 5, picked Wyatt up from the after-school program, drove home, made dinner, helped with homework, read a chapter of whatever book they were working through together at bedtime, checked the deadbolt, turned off the lights. It was a small life. It was also the first life she had ever owned outright. The clinic in Sebastopol was a good fit. The lead physician was a woman in her 60s named Dr. Ellen Harper, who had been practicing family medicine in Sonoma County for 30 years and had the bone-deep calm of someone who had delivered babies and diagnosed cancers and held dying patients' hands through it all without losing her humor. Dr. Harper had not asked too many questions about the 3-year gap in Nora's resume. She had looked at Nora's hands during the interview, noted the steadiness, the small scars across the knuckles and palms, and had simply said, "You've done hard work before. You'll be fine here." Nora found that she loved the clinic, loved the pace of it, loved the continuity of seeing the same families come through the waiting room week after week, watching children grow learning the names of their pets and the names of their grandparents. She loved the smell of antiseptic and the sound of the blood pressure cuff releasing and the satisfying click of a properly inserted IV line. She was good at her work. She had always been good at it. And for the first time since nursing school, she was being paid what she was worth and coming home to a house that belonged to her. Wyatt adjusted to his new school with the same quiet adaptability he had brought to every other chapter of his short life. He made 2 friends in the first month, which Nora considered a minor miracle given his general preference for his own company. Their names were Ethan and Maya. Ethan was a boy with red hair and a gap between his front teeth who was obsessed with dinosaurs. Maya was a quiet black girl with braids and a serious expression whose father was an engineer at a wine country tech startup. The 3 of them formed a small, tight unit that spent recess collecting rocks and bugs and interesting leaves from the edge of the playground, which suited Wyatt perfectly. He did not tell his new friends about the dying man in the ditch. He did not tell them about the lighter in his dresser drawer, or the night he had crawled through tear gas, or the 14 motorcycles that occasionally appeared in his driveway. Those were not secrets exactly. They were just things that did not need to be explained at recess. He had learned early that some stories belonged only to the people who had lived them. His teacher, a young woman named Ms. Rodriguez, called Nora in for a parent-teacher conference 3 weeks into the school year. Nora had braced herself for bad news. Instead, Miss Rodriguez had smiled and said that Wyatt was one of the most emotionally mature students she had ever taught. He was calm under pressure. He helped the younger kids when they got overwhelmed on the playground. He had sat with a first grader who was crying on the first day of school and stayed with her until she felt better. He was, Ms. Rodriguez said, a remarkable child. Nora had driven home that afternoon with her hands steady on the wheel and tears streaming silently down her face. Not sad tears, the other kind, the kind that come when you have been bracing for impact for so long that you forget what it feels like when the impact does not come. Gideon came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. It became a ritual. He would arrive around 2 in the afternoon alone, now riding a smaller bike than his old custom Harley because his leg could not handle the weight of the original. He would sit in the second rocking chair on the porch. Nora would bring him coffee, and they would talk or not talk for an hour or two, watching Wyatt play in the yard or the garden or the vacant lot next door, where he was currently engaged in an elaborate archaeological project involving a broken fence post and a jar of interesting pebbles. They talked about small things mostly: the weather, the garden, a recipe Darlene had shared with Nora that involved cornbread and a cast iron skillet. Gideon told her stories about the club in the old days before everything had gotten so complicated, back when being a biker meant riding fast and drinking hard and picking fights with college boys at roadhouse bars. He made it sound almost innocent. Nora suspected he was editing heavily, but she did not call him on it. He had earned the right to tell his story however he wanted to tell it. Sometimes they talked about Caleb. Not often and not for long, but enough that Gideon's voice stopped cracking when he said the name. Nora learned that Caleb had played the trumpet in middle school and had been pretty good at it, that he had wanted to be a veterinarian when he was 10 and had cried when the family dog died when he was 12, that he had started pulling away from his father around the age of 16 the way teenagers do, and that Gideon had told himself it was just a phase and had not pushed hard enough to understand what was actually happening in his son's life. I thought I was giving him space, Gideon said one afternoon staring at the garden. Turns out I was just giving him room to disappear. Nora did not offer false comfort. She did not tell him that it was not his fault or that he had done the best he could. Those were the kinds of things people said because they did not know what else to say. Instead, she said, "My mother used to tell me that the hardest part of loving someone is watching them make choices you can't make for them." I think she was right. I think that's what she meant when she said parenting was the longest heartbreak there is. Gideon looked at her. Your mother sounds like she was a smart woman. She was. She died when I was 21, breast cancer. My father remarried a year later. I never forgave him for that, which was probably unfair, but I was 22 and angry, and grief doesn't always play fair. Is he still around? He lives in Phoenix with his second wife. We exchange Christmas cards. He has never met Wyatt. Nora paused, sipping her coffee. That's my doing, not his. I kept Wyatt away from him because I was afraid of what he would say about Derek, afraid he would try to get me to go back, make it work, for the boy's sake. She smiled thinly. The things we do to protect the people we love. Sometimes those things hurt other people who loved us once. Gideon rocked in his chair. Maybe you call him. One day, when you're ready. Maybe. They sat in silence for a while. A hummingbird darted into the garden, hovered over a salvia bloom, and darted away again. I'm thinking about retiring from the club, Gideon said. Nora turned to look at him. She had not expected that. Not all the way. Brick would probably shoot me if I tried to hand him my patch. But the enforcing, the running, the collecting, I can't do any of it anymore, not with this leg, and honestly, I don't want to. I've been doing it for 30 years. I think I'm done. What would you do instead? Gideon shrugged. Darlene's been running the clubhouse kitchen for 15 years. She's getting older. She could use some help. I was thinking I could do that. Cook for the brothers, keep the books, be useful without having to put my hands on anybody. You cook. I cook pretty good, actually. My mother was Portuguese. I grew up in a kitchen full of garlic and olive oil and a woman yelling at me to stir the rice. Nora laughed. It was a small surprise sound. She realized it was the first time she had laughed out loud in Gideon's presence. What's funny? Nothing. Just, you don't look like a man who cooks Portuguese food. What do I look like? A man who eats beef jerky and black coffee for breakfast. Gideon smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes, the kind that made him look 10 years younger. I can do both, Nora. Those things are not mutually exclusive. Brick stopped by on Wednesdays, usually in the early evening, always alone, and always with some small, practical gift tucked under his arm. A toolkit for Nora's garage, a bag of mulch for the garden, a set of bicycle training wheels for Wyatt's birthday bike, which he had helped pick out at the hardware store in Santa Rosa. He never stayed long. He would drink a beer on the porch, ask after the clinic and the school and the state of Nora's deadbolts, and then mount up and ride away into the Sebastopol dusk. Nora understood what he was doing without either of them ever saying it out loud. He was checking on them. Not because he thought they were in danger, though old habits died hard, but because he had promised Gideon he would look after them, and Brick was a man who kept his promises. He was also, she suspected, a little lonely. He had been married once years ago before Nora had ever met him, but the marriage had ended badly and he had not tried again. His life was the club. His family was the club. And in Nora and Wyatt, he had found something adjacent to that, something that let him practice being a different kind of person for a few hours a week. One Wednesday in April, Brick arrived with a manila envelope instead of a gift. Nora noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. He was quieter than usual, more thoughtful. He accepted the beer she offered him and sat down on the porch railing instead of in the rocking chair, which meant he was planning to leave soon. "What's in the envelope?" Nora asked. Brick looked at her. Derek Clark. Nora's stomach dropped. The beer she had just sipped turned to acid in her mouth. She had not heard her ex-husband's name spoken aloud in over 3 years, and hearing it now in the warm April evening on the porch of her own house felt like a violation. What about him? "We ran him down a few months ago, after the thing with Mercer. Goggles did it. Took him about 2 weeks. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure what we'd find and I didn't want to stir things up if there was nothing there. But I wanted to know where he was, just in case." Nora set her beer down on the porch boards. Her hand had started to shake. And Brick opening the envelope. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The photograph showed a man in his early 40s standing outside a convenience store in what looked like a strip mall. He was thinner than Nora remembered. His hair was graying at the temples. He was wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt and had the drawn, tired face of a man who had been losing a long argument with his own life. "He's in Bakersfield," Brick said. "Been there about 18 months. Works at an oil services company. Lives in a trailer park on the east side of town. He's a drunk Nora. Full-blown. 2 DU is in the last year. Lost his driver's license 4 months ago. He's not in a position to bother anybody." Nora stared at the photograph. For 3 years, Derek Clark had been a shadow in her mind, a dark possibility, a man who might appear at any moment and reclaim something that had never really been his. And now here he was reduced to a sad photograph of a man in a wrinkled shirt outside a gas station, and she realized something she had not let herself realize before. He was not coming. He had never been coming. He had moved on the way selfish men move on, which is to say badly and toward the nearest bottle, and she had been carrying him around in her head like a loaded gun for 3 years when the gun had been empty the whole time. "Why are you telling me this now?" Nora asked quietly. "Because you deserve to know, and because I didn't want you jumping every time a car pulled into the driveway anymore." Brick paused. "And because Wyatt is going to ask about his father someday. Probably soon. He's 7. He's going to start noticing that the other kids have 2 parents, and he's going to want to know where his is. I figured you'd want to have an answer ready. A real one." Nora picked up the photograph. She looked at the face of the man she had married, the man who had once made her laugh and then made her afraid, the man who had given her Wyatt and then given her a reason to run. She felt something she had not expected to feel. Not hatred, not fear, not even pity. She felt nothing. It was the strangest sensation. She had spent so many years bracing against Derek Clark, preparing for his return, locking doors and checking windows, and rehearsing what she would say if he ever showed up. And now looking at his photograph, she realized that the Derek she had been afraid of lived only in her mind. The real Derek was a broken man in Bakersfield who had lost the ability to hurt anyone except himself. "Thank you," Nora said. She meant it. "For looking and for telling me." Brick nodded. He finished his beer. He stood up from the porch railing and handed her the envelope. "Keep it or throw it away. Your call." She kept it, not for Wyatt, not yet, for herself, as a kind of proof that the monster she had fled was just a man and not a very impressive one at that. Gideon moved into the small apartment above the clubhouse in Petaluma in late April. He sold the old house in Healdsburg, where he had lived with his ex-wife, and Caleb the house that had become unbearable to occupy alone after the funeral. The sale took a month. The house sold to a young couple with a toddler, which Gideon decided to take as a good sign. Let a new family fill the rooms. Let them paint over the places where his son's height had been marked on the doorframe in pencil. Let the garden that Caleb had planted be replanted by small hands that did not know what had come before. He gave Nora the cookbook his mother had kept. It was a thick, battered volume with a broken spine, its pages stained with olive oil and tomato juice, its margins filled with Portuguese annotations in a handwriting that Gideon's mother had brought with her from the Azores when she emigrated in 1962. He said he had been carrying it around in a box for years and had never found the right place to keep it. Nora, who could not read Portuguese, accepted it anyway and put it on the shelf in her kitchen next to the battered paperback cookbooks she had accumulated over her adult life. She liked knowing it was there. She liked the idea that Gideon had decided her kitchen was a place where his mother's recipes might live. Wyatt turned 8 in May. Nora threw him a small party in the backyard. Ethan and Maya came along with 3 other kids from his class and their parents. Darlene came too and brought a cake shaped like a motorcycle that was frankly too beautiful to eat, though eventually they did eat it. Gideon and Brick stopped by briefly bringing Wyatt a fishing pole and a tackle box and then left before the cake was cut because they understood that 14 motorcycles in the driveway of a children's birthday party would be too much. That evening, after the other children had gone home and Wyatt was asleep in his bed with a belly full of cake and a new fishing pole leaning against his bedroom wall, Nora sat on the porch in the dark and listened to the crickets. The house was quiet. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler was running. An owl called from the direction of the apple trees. The stars were out surprisingly clear for a night so close to Santa Rosa's light pollution. She thought about the year that had passed since that afternoon on Highway 1. The ditch, the lighter, the shattered door, the cinder block room, the tear gas, the hospital, the trial, the 14 motorcycles in her driveway, and the silver Zippo with 2 names carved into the bottom, and the man in the rocking chair beside her talking about tomatoes. She thought about Caleb, a boy she had never met whose photograph she had seen only once on Gideon's phone. A blonde teenager with a lopsided smile photographed at 16 on a fishing trip with his father. She thought about how that boy's death had set in motion a chain of events that had saved her son's life, about how the lighter he had carried as a talisman had become, through the strange mathematics of grief and loss and unlikely mercy, the object that tied her family's fate to a motorcycle club she had once been afraid of. The world did not make sense, Nora decided. It never had. You could not plan for any of it. You could not predict which afternoon would be ordinary and which would split your life into before and after. You could only do the next thing and then the next, and try to keep the people you loved alive and trust that sometimes, against all probability, the universe would send help in the form of a child with a peanut butter sandwich, or a biker with a shotgun, or a woman with a sewing kit. She finished her wine. She stood up. She checked the deadbolt out of habit, and then, smiling at herself, unlocked it again and left it that way. The neighborhood was safe. The night was warm. There was no one coming. Inside, she paused in Wyatt's doorway and watched her son sleep. His blonde hair was tousled across the pillow. One small hand was curled near his face. The silver Zippo lighter sat on his nightstand next to the fishing pole, and a jar of quartz pebbles and a battered copy of the first Harry Potter book. Nora crossed the room and pulled the blanket up over his shoulder. She kissed his forehead. She whispered the same thing she had whispered to him every night since he was born, a small private prayer that she had never told anyone about. And that meant only what she meant by it. I've got you, buddy. I've always got you. Wyatt stirred in his sleep but did not wake. She turned off the light and walked down the hallway to her own bedroom. Through the window, she could see the moon rising over the apple trees, silver and round and impossibly old. Outside, somewhere in the distance, the sound of a motorcycle engine carried on the wind. Not 14 of them, just one, heading away towards some other life, some other porch, some other story waiting to happen. Nora listened until the sound faded into the night. Then she closed her eyes and slept.